This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Well, good morning. The time is 10:03. It's the 11th of February 2025, and I'm still Lewis Goodall, still sitting in for James O'Brien here on LBC up to 1 o'clock here this afternoon. And there's lots and lots to get through. Very newsy day indeed. We've got the Vice President, JD Vance, currently addressing an AI conference in Paris. The European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, doing the same. Lots of news to come, I think, throughout the course of the show as well. We've obviously got the ongoing situation in Gaza and the sad fact that already the ceasefire seems to have stalled. Indeed, it has stalled because of a breakdown in relations once again between the two parties, and one side saying the other one isn't fulfilling their end of the bargain. And so we know for sure that the exchange of hostages has abated, at least for the moment. And President Trump saying that if they are not all returned by Saturday, not in dribs and drabs, not one by one, then all options will be on the table. And indeed, he suggested that fire will once again rain down on Gaza, which will obviously impact the civilians who are trying to return to what's left of their homes. Lots of that to come on the show today, and more besides. But we're going to start with the assisted dying bill and the news that already some of the changes that some of its opponents worried about are indeed coming to pass. Let's just rewind a little bit, shall we? You might remember, of course, it's a very classic media thing, this, isn't it? We talk about something endlessly. We say it's the biggest thing ever. We say it's the biggest social change since the Abortion Act of the 1960s and all the great social changes, reforms that Roy Jenkins, when he was Home Secretary, ushered in one way or another. And then we go quiet about it, as if it's a done deal. But of course it wasn't. I was in the House of Commons on the day that the assisted dying bill passed its second reading. It was an extraordinary moment, extraordinary day. The debate was, it's a cliche to say when people say it's the House of Commons at its best and all of that sort of stuff, but it was a high-quality debate. In general, a respectful debate, measured, had a good tone to it, had proper contributions, expert contributions, MPs offering their views and opinions and assessment on this very unusual Friday sitting, talking from first principles, which I think is important, as well as the practicalities. But the second reading is about first principles. And then what happens next in the parliamentary process, when all of the television cameras and so on and the journalists have gone away, is the nuts and bolts of the legislation, the important bits of the legislation, the ironing out process, where the bill goes into committee stage and MPs start to debate it line by line. And that is the process that has been taking place ever since. It was not a done deal that day. And indeed, it was worth noting, as I was reporting at the time and others did as well, that there were MPs in the House of Commons who made it clear that they were conflicted about the bill, conflicted about the principles, conflicted about the practicalities, and were lending their support conditionally to keep the debate going, but then would be reviewing their position in light of whatever the committee stage came up with. And indeed, that's, as I say, that's what's been going on ever since. And that process has certainly come back into headlines today, given that it has emerged that the assisted dying bill is going to be changed. And instead of cases being signed off by a High Court judge, a judge in session, which was one of the key safeguards that the proponents of the bill put forward to say that this is going to be the toughest and tightest legislation in Europe. If anything, it's probably too draconian. If anything, the conditions are drawn up to be too tight. That is going to be changed. It's going to be that if someone wishes to have an assisted death, then that plan would have to be signed off, not by a High Court judge, but instead by a panel of experts. That, it is said, by the proponents of the bill, including Kim Leadbeater, the MP for Batley. She has said, about the Spen Valley, I should say now, she has said that this will actually strengthen the legislation. The proposed law, and we've got to remember this is just for England and Wales, says a High Court judge must check each person is eligible and has not been coerced in making the decision to die. But that was at the second reading. In the committee stage, Leadbeater and others, the other proponents of the bill, are suggesting instead replacing the High Court judge in session with a panel of experts who would oversee applications. And they've done this, they say, for a number of reasons. They're arguing that it is strengthening the case because the experts would have others involved in it, including a psychiatrist and so on, so it wouldn't just be a legal opinion. But they're also saying that would nullify the concerns that were there that if there started to be quite a few cases being brought before judges, that the judicial system, which is already at breaking point, which already has huge delays for criminal cases and the like, family cases, all sorts, that would be made even worse than it is now. So they're saying actually that this bill is going to be strengthened by this change. You don't just have a High Court judge, you'd have a retired judge and then a panel of experts, including a psychiatrist. But the opponents of the bill, as you might imagine, including the Conservative MP Danny Kruger, who has been a leading critic of the bill, have said that while they welcome the idea of more experts being involved in the process, they have questioned whether they could be truly impartial like a judge. They say that you will have a group of people who are basically in favour, their proclivity, their instinct, their reflexes would be in favour of assisted dying, and therefore you would not have an impartial legal expert. And their argument is that this is already the dilution of the safeguards that they warned about. Leadbeater, for her part, has argued this is not about removing judicial scrutiny, but changing it instead to a judge plus model. Now, I want to talk to you about what you think about all of this and whether you agree with Kim Leadbeater that actually this is a superior proposal, that it's better than just taking it through the courts where you'd have to have sort of evidence that is presented in a very court-like manner that can be very cold, it can be very difficult, and it is far better to have a greater number of people with a greater amount of expertise making the decision? Or is it, as the opponents say, simply the first step towards a dilution that they warned about? And they're saying that the House of Commons was given something and proposed something, a prospectus which is no longer there. What do you think about what this says about assisted dying? Does it make you more in favour of it, less in favour of it? Does it not change your mind to begin with? And it is something that you yourself would consider you'd like to avail yourself of if the time came. I've got my own views about this. I'll share them with you, but I'll do that after we've heard from some of you. 0345 6060 973, 0345 6060 973, number the same as always. Let's talk first to Dr. Peter Prinsley, Labour MP for Bury, St Edmunds and Stowmarket. He is in favour of the assisted dying legislation. Dr. Prinsley, thank you so much for joining us this morning. You know what the criticism of this is. The criticism, as I've just articulated and outlined, is that this is a dilution of the safeguards that MPs were promised.
Oh, good morning, and thank you for speaking to me. I don't believe that it's a dilution. I think what's happened is that in the committee stage, the members of the committee have thought very carefully about it and have decided that having a panel of 3 experts will actually improve the scrutiny of each individual decision. And I rather agree with that, actually. I remember hearing some of the senior judges wondering what particular expertise they had to deal with this sort of decision. And, you know, they were thinking, I think, in particular, that having a psychiatrist able to assess mental capacity and a social worker who would be in a position to look at the family and consider the question of coercion would indeed be helpful.
In which case, Dr. Prinsley, why was that model, if it is so superior, not offered in the first place? You will accept, won't you, that the proponents of the bill set great store, put great credit by the idea of it being a High Court judge, and now they're saying, oh, actually, it doesn't need to be a High Court judge anymore. Can you understand why that rather weakens the overall argument?
Well, I think it is definitely proposed that each of the individual tribunals will have a very senior lawyer involved, either a KC or a retired judge. So I don't think it dilutes the expertise in any way. I think it actually probably widens the expertise.
Yes, I understand that's your point. I'm just wondering why it was, therefore, that the campaign led by Kim Leadbeater and others put such great store by the idea of it being a High Court judge if it turns out that actually was relatively trivial.
Well, I don't know exactly the answer to that question, quite honestly, Lewis, but I don't think that what we're doing here is diluting things. But I do think that we mustn't lose sight of the fundamental proposal here, which is to introduce a change in the law to allow people who wish to have assisted dying. I mean, I think that there are large numbers of opponents of this bill, and many of them in Parliament. And I think there's a risk that we could somewhat lose sight of the wood for the trees here. We must.
Yes, but you understand. I understand. You say you don't know why the change has taken place, Dr. Prinsley. That's fair enough. But you understand why, if nothing else, as a point of politics, being told 1 minute that the High Court judge is basically the staple of the toughest safeguards in Europe, to then in the next breath being told actually it doesn't matter quite so much. Why that your opponents and others who are perhaps ambivalent about it might be rather confused.
Yes, I don't think it's really fair to say it's the next breath. What's happened here is that a committee of the House of Commons has considered this matter carefully for some days, together with a whole lot of witnesses. And, this is the parliamentary process. It was always expected that when the bill, Kim Ledbetter's bill, went into committee stage, it would be considered and modified. And, as it progresses further through the parliamentary stage, it'll go to the House of Lords. No doubt there will be some proposed amendments from there too. So I don't think we're anywhere near the completed bill. This is just the latest amendment which has been proposed by Kim.
Do you understand why some of those who, I hear your arguments and saying that it will strengthen it. Do you understand the argument that has been put forward this morning by some who say that the reason they like the idea of a High Court judge and it being an official legal process, indeed this was a justification offered by people who were in your position at the time of the second reading, is that it is by definition judicious. It is a legal process, as opposed to having three people, one of whom is a retired judge, who are basically instinctively and reflexively in favour of assisted dying, whereas a judge is impartial.
I do understand why people have paused and are having to think about this. But I go back to my point that I think increasing the expertise available on this panel of scrutiny is likely to be an improvement. But I do understand the point about the difference between a sitting High Court judge and a panel, which is the latest proposal.
How will these people be appointed?
I believe that a commission will be appointed. The commissioner will be appointed by the Prime Minister, and the commission will consist of a High Court judge and a Deputy High Court judge. And these people will appoint the individual tribunals, which will be involved in the scrutiny of each individual case.
Is it your position? Because there's another position to this. We're talking about as if it's completely binary. Of course, there's another position which is in favour of assisted dying, but actually thinks that this legislation as it is currently constituted, or at least as it was constituted at second reading, is too tightly defined. Is that your position?
No, I actually, that isn't my position. I mean, I certainly have heard people say that, and they think that there are likely to be many individuals who would like to avail themselves, if necessary, of assisted dying, but won't be in a position to do so because of this legislation. But I think that what Kim's bill has done, which is to set very, very tight criteria, these are terminally ill adults who are within 6 months, expected to die within 6 months. And I think that is exactly the sort of proposal that I would agree with for this country.
You're a doctor yourself, of course. How would you have felt as a doctor whose obviously every instinct and natural instinct is to extend and prolong life and improve life? Would you have felt comfortable being part of this process? Had you still been, you're an MP at the moment, but if you're still a practicing doctor?
I am still a practicing doctor.
I'm sure you are. You're keeping your hand in.
And my area of specialty is ear, nose and throat surgery. And I've had to deal during the course of my career with many patients with advanced head and neck cancers for whom palliation has been utterly insufficient. And, it's long been my position that we ought to have this option available. When I was a young doctor, I thought it was not a good idea. But as I became more experienced and I saw more and more patients in the sort of difficulties that we're envisaging, I began to change my mind. And now I'm firmly of the view that this is something which ought to be an option for people. We're certainly not obliging people to seek assisted dying, but there are certain individuals for whom this would be an amazing reassurance. Therefore, I think we should have it.
What do you make of the argument that is put forward by many, which is to say that we shouldn't consider this until palliative care is much improved, because they worry that it will simply become a substitute for palliative care?
I think that palliative care needs to be the best palliative care we can possibly provide. But I And I don't think that palliative care and assisted dying are alternatives. I regard them as complementary to each other. I think that one of the things that has happened is that Kim's bill has led to a much wider conversation about the way in which we must invest in palliative care. And I hope that one of the consequences of this will be exactly that. But they are complementary, they're not alternative. And I can tell you that there are patients for whom even the best palliative care is insufficient to deal with the lack of autonomy, the misery, and the lack of dignity that people experience, some people at the end of their lives. It's no accident that the place in Switzerland that people go to is called Dignity.
What, just finally, Dr. Prinsley, what is your sense among your parliamentary colleagues about the chances of this passing now? Obviously, at second reading, there was a decent majority for it, although, as I said at the start, some of that support, it was said, was conditional, dependent on what emerged in the bill from committee in the House of Lords and so on. What's your sense of your confidence of it actually getting through the House of Commons ultimately?
I think that it's probably very close. I thought it would be very close on the day of the second reading, and I think there were quite a lot of MPs who walked into Parliament on that morning with their minds not made up and listened, as you said, to that very, very, I thought, sincere debate. So I expect that the same thing will happen again at the next session. I think it's just very, very difficult to tell. I hope very much that the bill will progress, but I certainly don't think we can be sure of that.
Dr. Peter Prinsley there, Labour MP for Bury St Edmunds, in favour of the assisted dying bill, saying that his medical career made him more in favour of assisted dying over time, not less. I wonder if that is, if you're in medicine or if you're in the NHS, if that's an experience you have. Perhaps you've had the opposite. Do you think that these changes, proposed changes to the bill to replace a High Court judge with a panel of experts, including a retired High Court judge, strengthens the case for the bill or weakens it? Does it make the safeguards stronger, or is it the start we've already engaged on the start of the long descent of the slippery slope? 0345 6060 973 0345 6060 973. Call now and you will get through. Lewis Goodall sitting in for James O'Brien here on LBC. The time is 10:20.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Is 10:22. We're talking about the proposed changes to the assisted dying legislation. I want your thoughts on whether or not you think it is a good idea, the proposed changes, and also getting back to first principles about whether we think it is a good idea at all. 0345 6060 973. Got a text here from Steve who says, "Morning Lewis, how long will it be before you plug your Sunday show? You seem to do it quite a lot, especially covering for James O'Brien. We know who you are and when you're on." Really appreciate that, Steve. Just a great opportunity to remind people that my Sunday show, Sunday with Lewis Goodall, appropriately named, is on from 10 till 12. Let's talk to a different Steve, I think, from Eastbourne, who's got something to say about this subject, assisted dying. Steve.
Good morning, Lewis.
Good morning.
Yes, I know my colours to the mast. I'm a supporter of assisted dying, and I have been ever since my mother had a very bad death, very much against her wishes, a number of years ago. Right. Now, Dr. Prinsley spoke very eloquently about this, so he made a number of points I wanted to, but there's two I'd like to make, please. First is to re-emphasise it's not a question of assisted dying or palliative care. It's not one or the other. And if you need a proof of that, look at Oregon, which has had a good assisted dying law for a number of years and the best amongst the best palliative care in the US. So
there are other examples, though, in fairness, though, aren't there, Steve, that critics point to, Canada and others, where there has been a quite rapid expansion for different complicated reasons, which maybe we could get into, but there have been the slippery slope sometimes is slippery.
No, it's not. And I'll tell you for one, you must know this better than anyone else, Lewis. That's not how our legal process works.
Canada has a different legal system, but you can understand why
people
people might see these things and worry about it.
No, I can't. And I'll tell you that the main points I wanted to make, because I've spoken to people and politicians from both sides, there's always been the very small minority of people who are against this, because the public overwhelmingly support this. The minority of people who are against this will always do whatever they can to wreck the bill. And people like Danny Kruger made it very, very clear that since the bill passed its second reading, they were going to do whatever they can to wreck this bill. And with the greatest respect, this is important, please. With the greatest respect, people like you don't help with the language that you use. When you were talking about the so-called dropping of the High Court judge, you said doesn't matter quite so much. Nobody said this. What's happened at committee stage is they've actually thought, well, hang on, whilst that was a good suggestion initially, it's even better to strengthen the bill, to have a panel of experts, because the main thing the judge was going to rule on, coercion is subjective.
Well, Steve, it's not my job. No. Steve, it's not my job to help or otherwise. My point was, which I think is fair, and it is indeed completely accurate because this is what they're saying. Opponents of the bill are pointing to the change and saying, which is true, that at second reading they were told, and they were told by the proponents of the bill, that the High Court judge element was central and vital and important, and are now being told it is not going to happen in that way. So it is perfectly reasonable to point out that discrepancy, ask for an explanation, and say that that is empowering, which it is some of the critique of the bill.
Well, it's not, because firstly, as everybody knows, the whole point of going to committee stage is to strengthen the bill. As Dr. Prinsley said, it won't go
as a matter of fact.
Hang on, because this is really important, Lewis. It's all to do with language. Why do you say that the committee have basically said, quote, and this is quote, about the High Court judge from you, doesn't matter quite so much.
Well, no.
That's misleading. They're not saying that. They're saying it's an even stronger position.
Steve, take a breath, mate. Right, listen. I didn't say that they'd said directly that it doesn't matter quite so much. What I said is you can understand the change and you can understand some of the criticism from the other side, because they did not say, the proponents of the bill didn't say, well, maybe we'll have a High Court judge, but when we get to committee stage, maybe we won't. They said that this was the central safeguard. They pointed to the fact that this was present and they don't have it in other systems. So you can see that politically, in terms of the change, you can see why that would make it weaker, or you could see why it would empower the arguments of those who are against it. I myself are in favour of assisted dying, but I'm an impartial enough observer and analyst to point to that discrepancy and say you can see why it would be a problem for the proponents.
Yeah, well, it's a change. So why do you feel it? Why do you not just say, as you have done there, that this is where you just why use the language doesn't matter quite so much? Because that straight away you're suggesting that weakens the bill, and it doesn't. It strengthens it.
All right, Steve. Grateful to you. Andy is in Birmingham. Andy.
Good morning, Liz. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Yeah, what do you make of this one?
I think that assisted dying is a moral necessity now. I work in the NHS and I go out to patients that are basically rotting away in their beds, unable to care for themselves. And if you want any idea of the definition of the word dignity, you just have to see what these patients unfortunately have to go through. And I get that people will point to this change in the bill, but I don't think going for a panel is necessarily a bad thing, because you then have a wider range of opinion which can only benefit the patient, as long as it's applied independently. Because yes, in some cases there will be risks of coercion, or somebody wanting to get hold of somebody's will a little bit earlier than they should do. But by and large, I think the more independent the panel, the better. And if, rather than it being one person making that decision, which it would not be a very pleasant position for any single person to be in, but being able to have that, not credence, but I know what you're saying.
Yeah,
would, I think, only benefit both the panel themselves and the patient.
Do you, Andy, do you understand why, this is the point I've been sort of trying to get at, as I was saying to Steve, I myself, for reasons we can go into if anyone's interested, are in favour of it, but I can also understand why it is that someone who was ambivalent about it could be confused at the change that has taken place because there was such centrality and emphasis put on the idea of there being a High Court judge. Just explain to people why you think it would be better to have that panel.
One person having effectively the power of life or death over people would be mentally taxing, draining, and could result in decisions being made that weren't necessarily in the patient's best interest, more in their own sort of personal conscience. Whereas having a panel where that decision is shared, it allows for a lot more independent thought, debate, and consensus for what is actually best for the patient. And it's no one person making a decision.
Was there a moment, a particular case or a moment, Andy, when had you always thought this, or was there a moment when you just thought that actually this is a change that we've got to make?
I'll be honest, prior to coming into the NHS, I would have been against it. No,
really?
If somebody's able to live, then they should live. But doing the job that I do, and seeing the conditions in which some people, you can't even say that they live, it's a case of they exist. And it's just not fair. People themselves wouldn't want to be in that position. And it's possibly one of the last acts of independent control somebody could have in making that choice. Another high-profile case you can point to, somebody that was massively in favour of assisted dying, was the author Terry Pratchett. He knew that he was facing a condition where his mental abilities would steadily and sometimes acutely decline until he became nothing more than a shell, and he didn't want to exist like that.
What do you make of the argument, Andy, which again is put forward, and I've interviewed people like Diane Abbott and others who are very much against the bill, that they're concerned, they think that vulnerable people who are perhaps less formally educated, older people from ethnic minority, all sorts, people who maybe for whatever reason are more easily coerced, they think that their communities will be especially impacted by this, and that it's all very well for, and this is their view, it's not my view, I'm just for clarity, I'm just putting it forward, their view, it's all very well for the kind of sharp-elbowed middle classes who have sort of command and control and maybe full autonomy about what they're doing, by comparison to more vulnerable people who don't and will find themselves in a position where they feel compelled to do something that deep down they don't really want to do. What would you say to that?
We have safeguards in place already to deal with patients that are classed as vulnerable or easily influenced. There are advocacy services, there are advocacy panels, there are easy ways of setting up the safeguards that would ensure that this is what the patient wants and not what somebody else alongside them wants. The protections are there, the protections can be incorporated, and my personal opinion is ultimately a panel will enhance that rather than be to its detriment.
Andy in Birmingham, really clear, really grateful for your thoughts on all of this. What do you think? Do you think that assisted dying is an idea whose time has come and we need to be less taboo about death, which is, I think, part of the story around all of this? Sometimes we just like to look the other way and pretend it isn't coming for all of us. And of course, we know that it is. What a cheery start to the show we're having. 0345 60 60973. Even cheerier, we're going to be checking in on the situation in Gaza next and what President Trump, the latest missive that President Trump has offered us overnight on all of that. That is to come. But first, at 10:32, let's get the very latest LBC News headlines with Thomas Watts.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 10:36. Denise's text about assisted dying says, Lewis, you've had 2 brilliant call-ins so far. I'm a retired nurse and have been witness to much suffering. Dignity in dying should be paramount. A 3-person panel is much better than clogging up the judicial system, in my view. I lost my younger sister to cancer last year. Love your show, Denise. It is really important to remember, it can sound so clinical, this process, can't it? This legislative process. In fact, I'm watching live pictures now of the committee in the House of Commons in Westminster as MPs scrutinise in committee the assisted dying bill. Rare, very rare to see carried on the news channels, a committee procedure or a committee stage of a bill actually being debated, but such is the importance of this issue. And as I say, a reminder that for so many, one way or another, human stories sit at the heart of this, and a subject that, as I say, we rarely talk enough about, which is death, because in so many ways it still seems there's a kind of Victorian taboo about it for us. Want your views on the assisted dying legislation and whether you think it is an idea whose time has finally come. 0345 60 60973. First, though, let's just update ourselves with the latest situation in the Middle East and Gaza. President Trump overnight saying that the Gaza ceasefire should be cancelled if all remaining Israeli hostages are not returned by noon on Saturday. And he warned Hamas as part of that all hell is going to break out, as if that hadn't happened already. The US president's intervention came hours after Hamas has said it will delay the release of more hostages and accused Israel of violating their ceasefire deal. Hours earlier, of course, Mr. Trump again elaborated further on his so-called Gaza peace plan, confirming that Palestinians would not have the right to return under his plan for US ownership of Gaza, contradicting his own officials in his administration who said that they would be relocated temporarily. You're not making it up as you go along, are you, Donald? Let's talk to Anthony King now. Professor Anthony King, Professor of War Studies at the University of Exeter. Professor King, thanks so much for joining us this morning. What do you think the chances are that this ceasefire holds and the return of hostages is resumed?
I think it's quite likely. Yes, we are familiar already with Trump's often slightly undiplomatic, excessive language. But I think that he's actually behind the scenes been leveraging Prime Minister Netanyahu and also the Hamas leadership and various other leaders in that region. So I think actually, although we might deplore the language that President Trump has used, I'm actually reasonably confident that the kind of denial of release of hostages by Hamas is a kind of political move which will be resolved. I actually think that the ceasefire will hold, and I'm hopeful, let us say that. Maybe I'm not analytical about that, but hopeful that it will hold. There's other problems, of course, within that context. But I actually think this will be resolved, yes.
Is there any truth and credibility to Hamas's claims that Israel is violating the terms of the ceasefire?
Well, there has been some gunfire, there has been some violent incidents, there has been the use of military force since the ceasefire came into action. And that, of course, the stage one of the ceasefire, one of the conditions was that there'll be humanitarian aid delivered and there'll be no further Israeli military action. There have been minor skirmishes. The reports are there have been minor skirmishes and some possibly use of small arm fire and possibly air bombardments in certain areas. So there is some potential claims, but my personal view of this is based on that evidence. It's not catastrophic. It's not a reignition of real military operations, and I think that Hamas will continue their leveraging and will continue with this ceasefire. I mean, the other option is the Israelis to start military action again. Well, Hamas knows where that will lead. So I personally see this as a maneuver rather than an absolute derailing. And of course, as an individual, I hope that is the case.
President Trump has said that unless the hostages are all returned by Saturday, that fresh hell will break loose. It's difficult to see what that could be, isn't it? Fresh hell has already rained down for 12 months.
I mean, he behind the scenes, clearly he has worked on Netanyahu quite strongly. And fresh hell to me means a resumption of full military operations against Hamas. I think this is an interpretation I'm no better than anyone else in interpreting Trump's sometimes slightly gnomic rhetorical statements, but that's what I think he means. I actually think it's unlikely that we'll see full-scale return to the war that we saw for 15 months. I actually think it's unlikely. There's bound to be more difficulty as we move to stage 2 and stage 3. This is a highly complicated strategic and political situation, a highly delicate military one. There's bound to be errors, there's bound to be further frictions, there's bound to be, frankly, some further fighting in Gaza at a lower level. I think that we will move forward in some way. The next question is, which obviously your news reports have been talking about, is where does the wider strategic plan that Trump has put forward, namely the removal, the transfer, the deportation, whichever word you want to use, of Gaza civilians to Jordan, to Egypt, elsewhere, is that a realistic final phase? Because that is Trump's ultimate strategic goal in terms of the conclusion of this ceasefire, moving into an actual full peace deal, a full armistice, a complete political settlement. And the question of the realism of that, I think, is very open.
What is left, Professor, of Hamas's military capability after these 18 months or so of bombardment?
Well, it's been very significantly degraded. I mean, their entire military leadership and indeed political leadership, as we know, has been destroyed. Mohammed Deif, Sinwar, etc., Ismail Haniyeh have all been killed. The three brigades, which consist of about 25 battalions, the Israeli intelligence on those is almost every single one has been severely decimated, especially at the leadership level. However, military forces can reconstitute. ISIS has partly reconstituted after its catastrophic defeat in Mosul in 2017. And we can see from the hostage releases that there are very significant numbers of armed Hamas militants. So although Hamas military capability has been very seriously denuded, it's not eliminated. That strategic goal, I think, was always highly, highly unlikely. Indeed, I might even argue ultimately impossible in the context of Gaza. But it's been denuded. But of course, the political support for Hamas and its political as a political movement exists. So the constitution of itself as a military force is entirely possible with Iranian support, with its own autonomous capabilities. So Hamas is not done as a political force, and it's not done as a military force, which of course is deeply concerning, and also shows that the original Netanyahu strategy of the complete elimination, liquidation of that as a movement was a very difficult, if not unrealistic, aim to go for.
And just finally, Professor, obviously the president has clarified again that under his plan, his real estate plan for Gaza, Gazans, Palestinians would not be allowed to return. Now, he's having to constantly clarify, and then the White House is putting out clarification statements, and then he's clarifying the clarification. Should we be taking any of this seriously?
Well, I think there's two things that are serious. One, and I've sort of articulated, Hamas represents an extreme force which is unacceptable. It's unacceptable to the Israelis that Hamas should rule Gaza after the 7th of October attacks. Secondly, which Trump absolutely articulates correctly, Hamas is in Gaza is in ruins, and it's going to take months and, in fact, years and billions of pounds of investment to rebuild it. So there is a material problem. How do you house, provide the livelihood, provide aid and a lifestyle for all of those refugees? It's a profound problem. It's a profound regional problem. It's a profound international problem. The question is, can you just resettle them? And I would say no, because Gazans don't want to be resettled. No country, Jordan, Egypt, etc., don't want to accept more or any Palestinian refugees. And so a resettlement would be forced resettlement. That would be in breach of international law and would generate extraordinary levels of resistance and renewed conflict in the Middle East. So I must say, although there's a kernel of what Trump is saying, which identifies a serious problem, which we all need to recognize, the actual plan of resettlement, I struggle to understand it in political, in strategic, or in military terms. I have to confess.
Professor Anthony King there, Professor of War Studies at the University of Exeter, being somewhat more diplomatic than I was, but I stand by my initial assessment. President Trump is making it up as he goes along. You're listening to Lewis Goodall here on LBC. We're talking about assisted dying. Your thoughts on whether or not this is a piece of legislation whose time has come. 0345 6060 973. The time is 10:46.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 10:49. A few of your texts on assisted dying and the proposed changes to the legislation. Andrew says, Lewis, I do not understand the justification for an assisted dying bill without first committing to world-class palliative care. An earlier caller described people being left to rot in their hospital beds, highlighting the poor level of care some people are receiving. Surely, in the absence of excellent palliative care that could greatly relieve suffering, some will feel enormous pressure or desperation to request an assisted death. Sarah says, I think too often the assisted dying bill is considered as something that will only affect others. It will affect everyone. If people think instead about whether they would want to have a right to end their own life humanely, if they were terminally ill one day, it might change their mind. Death comes to us all, and many of us won't have a dignified end if nothing changes. And one more on this, another one's more on this. It said, my mother died of Lewy body dementia, and her needs were really to die quietly in a hospice rather than being rushed into hospital. And numerous times she was treated with great dignity, but it was very, very hard. Assisted dying is not needed and really would have placed more stress on us as a family to consider her assisted death. If you don't think that is coming, I think you are naive. People don't want to hear that the complicated answer is to have loving places in which people's natural deaths can be managed and relatives have peace of mind. I think that the point made by Sarah there about it coming for us all is absolutely central. And I have to say, just in terms of my own views on it, although I completely, of course, can see how someone might come to another point of view, and we do need to, of course, be careful about safeguards, and we do need to be careful about coercion, of course we do. I've always struggled to understand how it can be that the state could compel us as individuals not to end our lives at a time of our choosing. That it is ultimately, I do see parallels with abortion, ultimately it is a medical procedure, and we have liberty and autonomy over our own bodies and our own minds. And if I were trapped in a dying body, I knew that there would be a way out if only I could have some help, I think I would really struggle, really, really struggle. Same if I had a relative in that position, knowing that that was available but not legal. And that for what I would say is our own squeamishness, our own taboo, that we weren't willing to give people that option. But as I say, I can see how others might come to a different view. It's a difficult one. Angela, in Muswell Hill. Angela, your view?
Yes, I'm on the fence about assisted dying, mainly because of concerns about safeguarding and it being misused. So for me, the removal of the judge part of it, going through a court of law, is enough to sort of make me veer towards the other side of not supporting it.
Right.
Because it's a fundamental difference between having this go through a court of law with a judge who makes decisions about people going to prison for 30 years on a daily basis, for example, and a panel of 3 people. I think there's a really big difference. And that panel of 3 people have got their own prejudices, their unconscious bias that they've got, personal circumstances and personalities. And by being on that panel, by the nature of it, they're going to be more likely to support assisting dying requests, just by the nature of it. And therefore, I worry it would turn into more of a sort of, what reasons have we got to say no, rather than anything else. So, but I think going through a court of law makes our system, our process much different, and is a fundamental change. And I think the other concern I have is that this will be diluted as time goes on. So this first attempt at dilution is to me a red flag, and it's ridiculous to say it's not a dilution. It's just weasel words to say it's strengthening it. Of course it's not.
Well, what do you make of the argument, Angela, that has been put forward on this programme? I don't know if you heard the Dr. the MP earlier on today this morning, saying that far from diluting it, they think that it is augmenting the authority and the strength of the panel because you're bringing in different expertise rather than just the legalism of a judge.
Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? I mean, if you're going to make a change at this stage, you've got to make an argument, a rationale for why that change should be. Strengthening it is a good way of doing that, but I think it's clearly not. You've got the idea of a retired judge. Well, they don't retire till they're 75, so that's somebody who's potentially quite elderly and potentially out of touch. You've got another couple on there who, as I say, will bring their own prejudices, their own biases, their own personalities in, and this isn't the place for that. That sort of life and death decision is somewhere that belongs in a court of law.
But if a judge can be impartial and can be trained to be impartial, then surely that these people will be there in a professional capacity can also bring their own impartiality to bear.
Well, you say that. A judge makes those sorts of decisions on a daily basis, and they have a lot of training.
They don't. No, this has never happened before.
Those sorts of decisions, life or death. Well, if you, I mean, in the past they did make life or death decisions, didn't they?
Yeah, but a long time ago. No judge currently serving will have made a life or death decision.
Well, you could argue that putting somebody in jail for life is a life or death decision. I mean, it's pretty massive, and your average person doesn't make decisions.
But
like
normally,
that.
when a judge
this is a new field for that panel of 3 people. There's nobody who's used to making those sorts of decisions. So for me, taking it out of a court of law is really quite a fundamental change.
Okay, Angela, grateful to you. Hannah is in Faversham in Kent. Hannah, your view on this?
Hello, hi.
Good morning.
I understand this is a discussion that is very technical and could, go on and on. But I just wanted to share my experience. Really, talk about out of the mouth of babes. We've recently lost my mum from pulmonary fibrosis.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Which is a horrendous disease. We were fortunate enough to have her at home, but ironically, last summer we had to have our Labrador put to sleep, and it was done in a very planned way. He was done at home. He didn't suffer at all. As the vets say, better a week too early than a day too late. And it was all very peaceful and perfect. When my mum was in her dying stages, and don't get me wrong, the nurses were amazing. However, my little girl said to us, "Mum, why don't we get the vet? Why can't we get the vet?
Gosh.
This is horrendous." And I thought then that is a really powerful statement, because obviously...
I suppose you didn't know what to say.
Well, every part of me was like, yes, why don't we? You know, Nanny was, without being too brutal to your listeners, suffocating to death. She was telling everyone, yes, I want to go to sleep. I want to go to sleep. And don't get me wrong, the nurses were doing their, to make it peaceful. She was at home. However, when a child says to you, "I don't understand, Mum, why we can't get the vet," I just thought it was, I just wanted to share that really out of the mouth of babes and
your mother,
how
you
children think.
Your mum would definitely have availed herself of the assisted dying process if it had been available, you think?
I mean, don't get me wrong, my mum didn't want to go. She fought that every ounce of her being. However, the last 3 days, she was running out of air. And how would you want someone to stay like that?
And what did the doctors say when you were talking to them? And presumably you were saying, "Is there nothing you can do?" I mean, what did they say to you?
Well, of course, their experience they were amazing. Don't get me wrong, and they made Mum incredibly comfortable. So she did eventually just go to sleep, but it took 3 days, and I just think, wow, we do, as I say, with the vets, a week too early rather than day too late. Don't let these animals suffer. Make it as peaceful as possible. And then we had to just lie there, watching Mum battle. It was horrendous. I understand the case is far more complex than that. Don't get me wrong. No. But yeah, it's playing on my mind. And even to this day, our little girl still is like, that's alien to me, Mum. I don't get it. I don't get it. And I think she's right in a lot of ways.
Do you think does it rankle when I've just seen a text just come in saying it really annoys me? This is the person saying this. It annoys me hearing healthy people talk about assisted dying who haven't had experience of it and projecting their views. Is that something that resonates with you?
I think, like the lady said, it comes to us all, but we don't really want to think about it, do we? I mean, my mum was very much like, if I wanted to talk about that while she's well, she'd be like, "Oh no, I don't want to talk about that." So it is until you're poorly, actually. Certainly in the last 3 days. I mean, she had a capacity. She was very, with us. And her decision absolutely would have been, I can't do this for much longer. But it's hard, isn't it, when you're feeling fit and healthy to even try and talk about that. It's really difficult.
Hannah, really, really grateful to you for sharing your story and your mum's story, and we hope that you and the family are bearing up, because obviously a really difficult process, but really valuable to hear, as you say, with someone with direct experience of that process and how human and how important this conversation really is. We're going to move on now, though, and talk to a person I think he's just about human, and that is, of course, Elon Musk. Mr. Musk, you will be amazed to hear, doesn't think that he's got enough power, because not confined and not content with the political power he has, the economic power he has from being the richest man in the world, not content with owning one of the primary, if not the primary, journalistic distribution mechanisms in the world, i.e. Twitter, he now wants to buy OpenAI to control the next bit of technology which will define our lives. Is this guy out of control?
James O'Brien on LBC.
The time is coming up to 11:04. You're listening to Lewis Goodall sitting in for James O'Brien here on LBC. I can see a few people sort of taking issue with our last caller there, saying, did she just compare her mother to a dog? Really, can she be doing that? Of course she wasn't. Of course she wasn't. What she was doing was making the point. People are so extraordinary, I think, in terms of how people are so quick to jump on these matters. She was saying, which I think is a reasonable point to make, which is to say that, okay, human life, of course, is more precious than that of animal life. Of course. I'm a big believer in that, of course. But what she was saying is that we, and this is a view that lots of people have, that we treat animals often with more dignity than we do humans. And there are some people who do not understand that complete asymmetry, which you might not agree with, but is a perfectly legitimate point of view, particularly given she very bravely sharing her experience and her family's experience of watching her mother die, suffocating to death, which she says, difficult thing to say. But in a way, the problem with the assisted dying debate is very often we just look the other way because death is taboo and difficult and we don't want to deal with it. But we're all going to have to deal with it at some point, one way or another. We're going to move on now, as I said, though, and talk about a story which, when I was doing the show last week, we talked about a bit, but which has developed even more since then. And just forgive me, will you, if I sort of take a little bit of time just setting this out and why I think it's important, because it is complicated and it involves characters that, we may not have heard of or be that familiar with, but it's really important. Because for my money, I just do not think that this story is being reported properly. It's not being talked about properly. And I actually think it is possibly the most important global story right now. And that is the role that Elon Musk is coming to occupy and take in our politics, our financial lives, economics, the economic model and world that we're living in, our technological lives as well. And I think that there is a possibility, and this is what I want to talk to you about, that this is a man who becomes more powerful than pretty much anybody in human history, and how dangerous I think that is. Not just because Musk, in all sorts of ways, is clearly not an appropriate individual to exercise and exert that sort of power, but because it would be inappropriate and wrong for anyone, even a philosopher king himself, even Solon, to occupy that kind of power. You'll be aware, of course, and this sort of breaks down into two sections for you. Well, three, but the first part is the easiest bit. We know Musk is very rich. He's either the richest or second richest man in the world. His wealth is astounding. He basically rivals many actual countries, sovereign states in the world, for the amount of wealth he controls. We can have a debate, an argument about whether we think it is appropriate for anyone to command that sort of wealth. It obviously confers upon him enormous power. But let's leave that to one side, because we knew that. And there are lots of people who are very, very wealthy and keep a much lower profile. Much to his credit, I suppose, in a way, is out there. He's up there for critique. We kind of know, at least to some extent, what he's doing. But then there are two other elements, one of which is extremely new and has broken overnight, and it concerns AI, which we'll get to. But just first, on the politics, it seems that Mr. Musk is not content with being the richest or second richest man in the world and accepting the power that that confers. He also wishes to exercise political power, direct political power. That is something that he has been doing over the course of the last few weeks, given he has become such a central player and figure in the court of Trump. This alliance between MAGA and Musk has been one of the most important defining features of our politics over the last 6 to 12 months. And I say our politics because I'm not just talking about American politics, because we have seen with his acquisition of Twitter, now X, we have seen the role, the mediating role, the defining role in our politics that Musk can play. It used to be said that it was the media who controlled the agenda, that certain radio programs in the morning controlled the nation's or dictated the nation's agenda. No longer. That function, I think, arguably has never been weaker with regards to the control that the media has in our conversation. Instead, very often these days, even in this country, the conversation is dictated by, and indeed to us, by the latest thing that Elon Musk has said on Twitter. We have seen that play out time and time and time again. You might say that is like the newspaper barons that we've had for years, but rarely has someone so directly, daily, influenced the political conversation in such an obvious manner. So there is that. But this is the bit where I think it becomes really, really sinister, because at least you can say with that that's in the open, that's straightforward. There's no opacity to that. What I think is going on, and has been going on in the last couple of weeks within the US federal government, is breathtaking. It is breathtaking for two reasons. One, the sheer audacity of it. What Musk has been doing, and again, you might not have been following this, and that's perfectly understandable. You got busy lives. You're not following every little bit of what Musk is doing. But what Musk has been doing has been going in to US government departments, federal departments, with his minions, with his employees, 20, 25-year-old, 30-year-old staff, his closest confidants, laying people off shutting agencies down, seizing control of information and payment systems which have the access and details to tens, if not hundreds of millions of Americans. He has shut down agencies like USAID, the US Aid Development Agency. And he has done all of this, and he's doing it exactly as he did with Twitter. Go in, break things, smash things up, break them down. He is doing all of that without legal authority. In many of these cases, the agencies that he is shutting down, the things that he is doing, he does not have the authority to do so, even with President Trump's blessing and legitimacy. He doesn't. Only Congress can actually shut these agencies down. But the question is, and the key bit, is that Congress and others aren't willing to act because they are so acquiescent to Trump that the Republican majority in Congress is not willing to do anything about it. We have not seen anything like this before. Experts on democracy, others, have called it for what it is, which is someone like Timothy Snyder, an opponent of Trump in lots of ways, but someone who is an expert on democratic backsliding, has called it a coup. Now, the American media, and the media in this country in many cases, have not been describing it like that. It's barely got a mention. Or if it does get a mention, it's described as Musk going in, slashing federal spending, slashing, bureaucracy, all of this, that, and the other. No, that is not what it is. What it is Trump and Musk specifically, seizing control of elements of the American government illegally. Illegally. That's not some buccaneering, swashbuckling kind of pirate figure going in and sorting things out. It is someone acting extra to the law, extra to the legal framework. It is a form of state capture. And the really disturbing thing, that in much of the US media and in much of the British media, it is barely causing a raised eyebrow. We're treating it as if it's normal. That is the political end of things. And then overnight, we're seeing something else on the technological side of things. It's not just that he wants to plug us all into our brains on X. It's not just, as it has been rumoured, that he'd like to buy TikTok with the connivance and acceptance of the Trump administration. He's also saying now, overnight, that he would like to buy OpenAI. This, of course, basically being the Google of the future. What Elon Musk would like to do is even control what we see on the internet when we search for things. This all goes back to some extent to a feud he's had with the OpenAI CEO Sam Altman. But Musk has announced that he is leading a consortium of investors that announced it had submitted a bid for $97.4 billion for all assets of the artificial intelligence company to OpenAI's board of directors. This is the startup, of course, which operates, among other things, ChatGPT, because it's been looking to restructure itself. And in has swept off the back of all of this, Elon Musk. He was, of course, a co-founder of OpenAI, but left the company in 2019 and started his own AI company called xAI. The bid is now backed by several investment firms, including big US government contractors and entertainment companies. Now, if this were to be successful, and Sam Altman is saying that it's not for sale, we'll hear from him, a clip from him in a second, but if he were to be successful, and do not forget he has the connivance and acceptance of Donald Trump right now in everything he does, I think that there would be a case to say that Elon Musk would be the most powerful individual who has ever lived. And that is because he would enjoy those three pillars: unbridled, unrivaled economic power, extraordinary access without any guardrails or impediment, at least for the moment, in politics via his closeness and proximity to Trump and his exercise of almost unrivaled power within the US federal government. And then technologically as well, his control not only of the space program, SpaceX, obviously Tesla, his industrial power, but also his media power via X and Twitter, and potentially OpenAI as well. He would be able to control and see what on the internet as we do, what we see on the internet, because OpenAI is basically the next Google, and it is going to be a huge part of our lives, even more than it is at the moment, in politics, in things we search for, everything. I think that is profoundly worrying, and I think it is even more worrying that the media overall does not call it out for what it is. I shall not name the programme or the station, but I did hear earlier on today a description of Mr. Musk as going in, as I say, just, like going in and slashing US bureaucracy and all of this sort of stuff. This is crazy. This is crazy. This is not what we're seeing. In another country, if it were another country, we would call it what it is. It's a form of state capture, and we should be worried about it. And my concern is that no one's going to stop him. No one is going to stop him, because the media is acquiescent. The media is less powerful than it was. He controls much of the conversation, and indeed on top of that, he has such control of the levers of politics. How did we get here? How did we get here? What do you think Elon Musk's ultimate aim is? Because I think it is a form of world domination. And I don't mean that in sending soldiers in stupid hats into places. But what else is this other than an attempt to control almost so many aspects of our lives? This is Sam Altman on OpenAI talking about Musk's offer at the Paris AI Summit today.
Should you have taken Elon's offer?
You refused $1 billion for Elon Musk. What do you want to say to Elon Musk?
Receive what from him?
Almost $100 billion, right?
The company is not for sale. Neither is the mission. We're happy to buy Twitter if you want to talk about that.
Can you afford your own company now, though? It does raise that question. Can you afford to buy OpenAI off the non-profit now?
The board will decide what to do there. The non-profit will continue as a very, very strong thing. The mission is really important, and we're just, we're totally focused on making sure we preserve that.
So that was Sam Altman, the owner of OpenAI, or the leader of it, saying that OpenAI is not for sale, but it is going through a restructuring, and of course there could be a hostile takeover, and it is entirely possible. Musk, this is, as I say, a long-running feud between Musk and Sam Altman, but it's entirely possible that this could play out with Elon Musk being able to purchase OpenAI, and as I say, if he does that, it is possible that he will be, in my view, at least one of the most powerful people who have ever lived. Not least because, as I say, he has the open connivance and acceptance of the Trump administration. This is Vice President J.D. Vance, who's attending that same Paris AI Summit, the Grand Palais. This is what he had to say about regulation of AI.
We believe that excessive regulation of the AI sector could kill a transformative industry just as it's taking off, and will make every effort to encourage pro-growth AI policies. And I like to see that deregulatory flavor making its way into a lot of the conversations this conference. I'm not here this morning to talk about AI safety, which was the title of the conference a couple of years ago. I'm here to talk about AI opportunity.
So as you hear there from Vance, there is no prospect of America regulating AI anytime soon, and I think that prospect would become even more remote if Musk were to buy OpenAI. But honestly, this man is accruing astounding power. What do you think his ultimate aim is? And should we be scared of Elon Musk? 0345 6060 973 0345 6060 973. Want your thoughts on whether Elon Musk is starting to accrue so much power that he is a dangerous man. You're listening to Lewis Goodall here on LBC. The time is 11:18.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 11:20. Steve Tech says, wow, Lewis, you fake liberals hate democracy, don't you, mate? Trump was elected. So what, Steve? Well, this is such a weird understanding of democracy. Trump was elected. It was a very, very impressive victory in lots of ways. It wasn't massive, but it was an important victory. But the point about democracy is it is not just about elections. It's about institutions and the people who occupy those institutions operating within the rule of law. Otherwise, what you've got is not a democracy. It's an elective dictatorship. And what Trump is currently doing is allowing Musk to act illegally. And why I say this is important, there could be a constitutional crisis coming, because I said that Congress is not willing to stop Musk. Musk is acting illegally. The constitutional crisis will come if Trump and Musk choose to ignore the only other check on their power, and that is the courts. The courts, there are currently lots of cases going through the courts which are going to say that what Musk and Trump are doing is illegal. Now, the constitutional crunch moment comes if Trump and Musk ignore the courts, as J.D. Vance, the vice president, has suggested that they might, because he tweeted, if a judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the Attorney General on how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, also illegal. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. That is not how a constitutional system works. It is not how a democracy works. And that is chilling. And that is why I think that there is a clash coming, and something that I'm worried about. And it all centres on Elon Musk. How dangerous do you think Elon Musk is? Or do you think I'm overreacting? Tell me. 0345 6060 973. A little bit of breaking news as well before we go to Stuart. Hang on for 1 second, Stuart. Breaking news from PA. The Metropolitan Police cannot dismiss officers. This is a High Court ruling. The Metropolitan Police cannot dismiss officers by removing their vetting clearance. This is an important case which has been working through the High Court. We're going to get an update on that after 11:30 on the show, just working through the actual judgment as it is coming to us. Let's keep talking about Elon Musk and talk to Stuart, who is in Portsmouth. Stuart.
Hi, good morning. You mentioned earlier about why we're not seeing an awful lot of excitement or even sort of worry on the news or in the papers here, and I think it boils down to fear. Nobody wants to sort of draw the gaze of Musk and therefore Trump. At the moment, the UK has a kind of neutral, I guess, sort of relationship with the US, and everybody's just too afraid of upsetting that. And if it's worrying that it would take irritating Elon Musk, to sort of unbalance that. It's kind of terrifying.
It is. But don't you think, you can understand the US media in that, Stuart. What do you think about our media? Because as I say, I mean, I'm loath to criticise my colleagues, but I think it is entirely legitimate in this case, which is that I am struck and shocked by the extent to which this has all just been normalised, and it just is not normal for a democracy.
No, it really isn't. I mean, we've had our own issues with sort of people more in government doing sort of stuff that we've sort of raised our eyebrows at and just sort of kind of went, like proroguing Parliament, that sort of thing. It's kind of minor in the scheme of things now. But
yeah,
I think it does come back to fear. I mean, take the UK government, take anything like the BBC or Sky or whatever. Nobody wants to stick their heads above the parapet because the moment you get the sort of laser beam lunacy of Donald Trump looking your direction, they'll all duck and scatter, and they just want status quo for now.
Shall I tell you one of the problems, Stuart, I think in terms of reporting on it, and this would apply not so much to newspapers who have slightly different rules, but I think to broadcasting. One of the problems is that, of course, the rules we have around broadcasting in this country are such that we have to sort of, at their heart is the idea that although, of course, different political forces might disagree, on one level, they all agree with the basic rules. They all agree with the basic rules of the game, that they all support democracy. Now, what happens when you have a force which doesn't care about legality or democracy? It basically means that the rules that you have as a broadcaster sort of go out of the window because it relies upon basically everyone sort of playing the game fairly. But when someone doesn't play the game fairly, it kind of breaks the system. It breaks the broadcasting system because it means that you have to sort of call it out, but actually the sort of rules as they exist don't allow you to do it.
Yes, and what do you do? Do you kind of lower your own standards? Do you break your own rules? Say, well, the most powerful person in the world is up to something. We need to do something different in order to call it out. And then can you backtrack from that later, or do you just sort of stick to your rules, stick to your methods, and hope it sort of evens itself out in the long run? But then you end up being the person or the people who didn't say anything and didn't put their heads above the parapet. It's kind of a difficult conundrum.
What do you think his game is, Stuart? What do you think he wants, Musk?
Musk?
Yeah.
Well, what can he want? He's got absolutely everything.
Yeah.
He's got it all. I think I said to your colleague earlier, I said, I think he's just like kind of barking at the dogs. He's like, oh, look at that. I'll go and chase that for a bit. Oh, I've got it. Oh, I don't want that now. Oh, look at that. And he's been given the ultimate sort of long lead by Trump to go and chase and bark at whatever he wants to. I mean, he's not he's got more money than he knows what to do with. It can't be about money. It just has to be about ego and power.
Stuart, grateful to you. Grateful for your thoughts on all of that. Tom is in Shenton in Leicestershire. Tom.
Hi, Lewis.
Tom, you've got some thoughts on what you think Musk's ultimate aim and objective is.
Yeah, I think for him, it's all about Mars and always has been. I've sort of followed SpaceX since their very early days, and then by extension, Musk. While he's definitely got more eccentric, would probably be a nicest way of saying it.
Yes.
I do think everything that he's doing, still, you can view through the lens of getting to Mars, which has been his obsession for, forever, really, it seems.
But what does that, surely if he wanted to do that, why not just focus on that? How does sort of what he's doing in terms of the federal government at the moment and shutting down these agencies, going in and so on, how does that work with relation to what you're saying about Mars?
I think that the political influence he knows he will need if he's to get to Mars. The cutting, I don't know. I think he has been radicalised by his own platform.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that happens to a lot of people, and it's not a conversation that we talk about enough.
No. But I do think the influence that he's been, literally buying via Twitter, X, and all his influence with Trump, I do think it's around Mars. You saw his reaction in the inauguration speech when Trump said we're going to put the stars and stripes on Mars.
Yes, he was thrilled.
And I very much doubt that he'd have said that if it wasn't for Musk being in his ear.
All right, Tom, grateful to you. Andrea is in Leighton. What do you think Musk is up to? What he wants, Andrea?
Lewis, yes. First of all, I agree with you in your analysis of what El Trumpo and Musk are doing, which is they're doing a kind of capitalist putsch takeover of the power of the presidency and amplifying it. They are using sort of standard, what you might call Bolshevik techniques, too much chaos. There's only enough court of appeal time, only enough Supreme Court time.
It's a really interesting comparison. Sorry for interrupting you, Andrew. I think it's a really interesting comparison. I hadn't considered, actually, the sort of Bolshevik kind of comparison. I think it's actually a really, really apposite one. It is actually, there's actually a lot of the sort of the chaos, the kind of sense of revolution, the idea of trying to sort of throw out entire sort of elite class, bureaucratic class. Seeing, in some ways, the way Musk talks, and even Trump talks, ironically enough, has Marxist overtones.
Yes, they could be Trotskyites, couldn't they?
Yes, indeed, yeah.
And so you ask, what's the objective? There are a number of, as my Marxist friends say, objective contradictions in current capitalism they need to deal with. One is the huge public and private debts that the US owes to everyone. Some people say that gives them an immense leverage, but very soon they're going to bump into what their Chinese creditors want from them. And so I think one thing they need to do is they want to replace the currency with some Muscovite cryptocurrency and therefore welch on all public and private debts to external creditors. And that means that they need to basically have in place quite strong techniques of control and discipline just in case the bankers get out of hand. And so they need a lot of sort of, I don't know, not quite Hitlerian, but certainly fascist control techniques at their hands. And then Mr. Musk, AI exponent, he wants to shift consumer capitalism into its next totally AI-enabled, really surreal world that makes sort of science fiction like Blade Runner look, like a poor prophecy. So that's what they want to do. New currency, destroy overseas debts, and bring in a sort of...
Why do you think they want a new currency, Andrew? I've never heard him talk about that.
Because, first of all, the black gold in the Middle East is about to run out. And these people are thinking in terms of, 50 or 100 years. So
there's quite a lot of oil. There's still quite a lot of oil left in the Middle East, Andrew.
And, they cannot continue with this petrodollar recycling system where the necessity to price oil in dollars keeps the dollar afloat and basically puts lots of dollars in people's hands so they will continue to buy American debt. So that very clever system is about to hit the buffers, maybe 20, 50 years' time. And secondly, it's intrinsically better to use... I'm not a crypto advocate, but it's intrinsically better to have this cryptocurrency so that not only... Trump's a bit of a kind of free market monetary person. He doesn't believe in fiat currencies. He doesn't believe in debasing currencies. He just wants to renege on all debts and then start again.
Yes. All right, Andrew, grateful to you. The thing is that it might seem unlikely around the currency point, but honestly, the sky's the limit right now. Trump has enormous power. He won't always, particularly after the midterms next November. It's entirely possible, and if not likely, that he loses control of the House of Representatives. But then, as I say, the crunch moment is going to come before then, and it's going to come at a moment whether the administration, the executive, decides to accept court rulings which are definitely coming their way, which says that what they're doing is illegal. And whether you approve what Trump is doing or not, we should say his approval ratings are pretty robust right now. Whether you approve of what he's doing or not and what he's allowing and enabling Musk to do, the point is the Constitution is the Constitution. And if the executive does not obey what the courts say when they have done something which is illegal, then you're not in a republic anymore. You're in something quite different. And the democratic backsliding, which has been part of American political life in recent years, becomes ferocious and accelerates and becomes very rapid indeed. Before you know where you are, you're in a difficult and dark place, a constitutional crisis. Perhaps we've been in one for some time already. We're going to continue this conversation. What does Elon Musk want? Is he the most powerful man we've ever seen? Is he a dangerous man? 0345 60 60973. We'll be getting the latest on that Met High Court ruling in just a moment as well. But first, at 11:32, let's get the very latest LBC News headlines with Thomas Watts.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 11:36. We're talking about Elon Musk and the bizarre normalisation of what he is doing in much of the media, I have to say, by taking over federal agencies illegally, everyone thinking and acting as if that's perfectly normal. Juan, a few of your texts here, says, hello, Lewis, it's already too late. Musk is now out of control. When the midterm elections in America are cancelled, the game will be over. I don't think that will happen, Juan. I mean, maybe I'm just too optimistic about these things, but I don't think elections will be cancelled. Whether they operate in a normal fashion is a different question. Phil says, most of Musk's wealth, Lewis, is from Tesla shares. What's significantly underpriced is the impact Musk's behaviour is having on Tesla's sales. I wouldn't be surprised if he's ousted from the Tesla board before long, and that changes the picture significantly. And Angus says he'll go for POTUS. Well, if the constitutional order in any way is maintained, Angus, he can't do that because he wasn't born in the United States. I think the bigger question is whether Trump tries to suggest that he can run again, get over the 22nd Amendment because he wasn't elected to 2 consecutive terms. I still think that's quite unlikely, not least because of his age and other factors as well. But I did interview, some of you may have heard, Fred Trump, his nephew, on this show last Friday. He was absolutely clear that he thought that that's exactly what Trump will do. We will see. Gary is in Calais, who has something to say on Musk. Gary.
Hi, Lewis. I really enjoyed your stint, by the way. Good morning.
Bless you. Well, that's very kind. Thank you.
James. Very, very good. Back in 1963, there was an historian, A.J.P. Taylor.
Yes, great man. One of the great historians of the 20th century, yeah.
Absolutely. He did an article in a magazine it was the 30th anniversary coming up of the Nazis coming to power. And he said one of the great tools that the Nazis used was radio. Yes. And the way they did that was producing a cheap radio. Everyone could buy it. You could buy it on the Never Never, and it was in your home. Now, you never had to go and buy a newspaper. You never had to go out into a street corner. Hitler and the Nazis could talk to you in your home.
Yes.
He was there. In theory, there was no escaping it.
Yeah, I think most historians would agree that you would not have had fascism in the way that it developed without the advent of television and radio, particularly radio.
Absolutely. Now, he finishes the article with saying, can you imagine Genghis Khan with a telephone? We're now looking at the internet and Musk and what he's doing. I'm talking to you sitting on a hill in the middle of rural France. Mm. You can't escape it. He's everywhere.
Yeah, we're plugged into his brain at all times.
Absolutely. And what Musk wants is power. It's not the money anymore. Mm. It's pure power. And he's got the tools to do it. And it's incredibly frightening from where he will go. And when you can see what he wants from his background and everything else, and you can really see the states having an almost a Fort Sumter moment where there will be dividing lines. And where does America go from now? But it's all down to power with Musk. Simple as that.
Do you think there's anything that we can do in Britain and Europe, Gary, to protect ourselves?
Stand up to it, talk it out, speak about it. Mm. You have to confront it. It's no good when you can see I've got American family. It's not, and now they're looking. They supported Trump, police, that sort of thing. They're saying, hang on a minute, Trump's dropped us. He's put a target on everyone's back who's a copper by saying that we're releasing the people that were involved in January the 6th.
Yeah, I mean, that's another element we can't forget, that right now there is basically a paramilitary force that is loyal, particularly and peculiarly to Trump, that have all been released, and we know they're armed to the teeth.
That's right, he's unleashed the brown shirts.
Yeah, I mean,
he's given them a reason. to exist. He's supported.
Yeah, Gary, grateful to you. I always try and not do the whole sort of Nazi, rise of the Nazis thing, because I think it's reductive to some extent. I think that, like, you know, different if American democracy were to fall, and in my heart I'm still optimistic that it won't, but democracies don't just collapse in one way as they did in Nazi Germany. They can collapse in lots of different ways, and if it were to, then it would be particular and peculiar to our own time. But of course, it is difficult sometimes not to avoid at least echoes. I wouldn't say direct comparisons, some echoes. And what happened on January the 6th continues to be astonishing. What happened then, but also the fact that they were released almost instantly by the Trump administration, and again, for which he has apparently paid zero political price. Lorna is in Bromley. Lorna.
Hi, Lewis. Just on your point you made just now about the collapse, I think, what's that saying that says that it's suddenly, slowly, then suddenly?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something that sort of seems a bit, rings true about that. Great last call, actually.
Yeah, brilliant,
I was essentially calling to say the same thing, that it's just power, and it will never be enough, I don't think, for either Trump or Musk, who have, as far as I can see, sort of politically, apart from white supremacy, I can't really see much politically that they have sort of connecting them. I think they are very similar personality types, which, as I said to your producer, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I would say narcissistic personality disorder, or certainly narcissism. And it's never going to be enough. It's just power, and it is, to answer your question, extremely dangerous. I think your intro on this was really good and spot on. And as the last caller said, just talk about it. We have to talk about it, and it has to be
Why do you think it is,
reported on.
Lorna, that this is the other sort of subtext to all of this, isn't it? Why do you think that it's causing relatively so little comment? And when there is, it's almost talked about as if it's all quite normal.
I'd say a combination of fear and exhaustion.
Exhaustion, I think, is key. I think you're right. I think exhaustion, more than anything else, is the underspoken commodity in all of this.
Yeah, just the sense of powerlessness that people have generally. I mean, I feel it acutely here, and that's not even in the United States. Although, you know, I think anyone who is switched on, even in the slightest, to world affairs, sort of really probably, if they're not feeling that fear and exhaustion, should be. But yeah, it's so essential that all of this is spoken about more.
I think, Lorna, you put your finger on when you talk about exhaustion. I think this is the key commodity. I think Trump, let's leave Musk aside for 1 second, although he has that kind of relentlessness as well. I think Trump understands, and I think Trump's actual greatest asset has been that thing. There's an old Noel Coward quote talking about talent, and he said someone offered him someone in a casting sort of direction. He said, talent, don't give me talent, give me staying power. What Trump has got is staying power. He exhausts his opponents. He just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. You know, he's dominated 3 presidential elections now. He's the most kind of dominant figure since FDR in some ways, in terms of the length of time that he has dominated politics for. Even in Biden's presidency was dominated by him. It was just an interregnum. Everyone was always talking about what's Trump doing, what's he saying, whatever. And he simply has more tenacity. And I'm not saying this is a positive thing especially, but he has more tenacity than others.
And if you think about how much that was reinforced as well when he survived the assassination attempt, you know, he that sense of staying power, like literally in that case, was just reinforced. And I do think that he thinks, arguably correctly, that he's untouchable, which is just terrifying.
He is right now. Yeah, absolutely. Lorna, really grateful to you. I just want us to put it in this context, right? What I don't get is why we are not more worried about, even if he was a benign figure, which I don't think he is, clearly, but even if he were a benign figure, we would typically have concern about people having a monopoly on power, right? In this country, no one is allowed to own more than, say, 40% of the newspaper market. You know, that was one of the reasons why Murdoch wasn't allowed to buy even more newspapers. It amazes me that we're not applying some of that logic to tech firms and to these firms which are more powerful than even newspapers perhaps were. Just reading this comment here from an AI expert, a guy called Graham Stewart, who's the head of UK public sector at Checkpoint. He was actually the guy, or the company Checkpoint invented the original firewall in 1993. Big cybersecurity expert. He says concerns over AI ownership aren't just theoretical. We're already seeing the consequences play out. AI is being weaponized in cyber warfare. The power to control one of the world's most advanced systems has massive security implications. Cybersecurity is about security, and that includes protecting the integrity of the information itself. This is no different from long-running debates over newspaper ownership and editorial stance. But with AI, the influence is far less visible. Users may not realize how ownership shapes the information they receive, and many don't think about it because they simply want the tool to work. AI is moving so fast that it's becoming part of daily life before people have the chance to question its influence. If AI is the new printing press, we need to ask, who is holding the pen? Do you want that person, the person holding the pen, this is me talking now, to be Elon Musk? 0345 6060 973. The time is 11:46.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 11:49. We'll continue our conversation about whether you think Elon Musk is both the most powerful and dangerous man that we have in the world right now. Maybe you disagree. Most people seem to be agreeing with my analysis so far, but keen to hear from you perhaps if you think this is all overreaction. Maybe 0345 6060 973. First, so let's talk about this as promised, this Met decision to strip officers' warrant card being overturned. The Met Police cannot dismiss officers by removing their vetting clearance, the High Court has been told. This, of course, just judgment following allegations of rape, which were made against a particular officer who subsequently had his clearance reviewed and removed. This has been going through the judicial review process. LBC's reporter Fraser Knight is outside New Scotland Yard. Fraser, tell us about this.
Well, Lewis, this is a huge issue for not only the Metropolitan Police, but for police forces across the country after we saw the cases of Wayne Cousins and of David Carrick, two serving officers who had committed the most heinous crimes while they were serving with that uniform. The Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, had come into this job saying we need to find a way of sacking officers when there are warning signs that pop up against them. And so they had begun this operation called Operation Assure, where they looked back at some of those allegations that had been made against officers. They then would review their vetting. In some cases they have removed that vetting, and then they use that as the reason for dismissing people from the force. Now, this judicial review and the judgment that's been made here is going to have big consequences for the way that Scotland Yard can proceed in trying to clean up its ranks, as we've heard so often that they need to do. The judge agreeing with this case that Sergeant D. Maria, who had had a number of allegations made against them in the past of rape, of domestic abuse, all of which he denied and none of which he was convicted of, the judge has agreed that the Metropolitan Police cannot legally sack him from his job by removing his vetting on the basis of those allegations alone. And it all really comes back to the fact that there is no clear legislation, no clear regulation in how police forces can get rid of officers when they've had some of those allegations made against them. And in the past few minutes, we've been hearing from the Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, who says, quite simply, they don't know where to go next.
Today's ruling on the law has left policing in a hopeless position. We now have no mechanism to rid the Met officers who are not fit to hold vetting. Those who cannot be trusted to work with women, or those who cannot be trusted to enter the homes of vulnerable people. It is absolutely absurd that we cannot lawfully sack them. This would not be the case in other sectors where staff have nothing like the powers comparable to police officers.
Now, already, Lewis, as part of Operation Assure, there have been more than 100 officers and staff members who have had their vetting removed and have been dismissed from the police force. There are more than 300 who are going through the process just now. Sir Mark Rowley told us they will still remove them from the front line. They could still put them on what's called special leave, where their vetting isn't available to them, but they don't have the powers just now to sack them. And so he put a message to the Home Secretary, the same message that he's been putting to Home Secretaries over the past 2.5 years. We need to change the law, he says. It is absurd that we cannot get rid of the officers who are not fit to wear a uniform. We've also heard from the Mayor of London that he is angry at this result. The Police Federation, they backed this judicial review. That has caused a lot of anger among officers and staff within the force, but they have stood by this, and Sir Mark Rowley previously saying to us that it was crazy that they supported this in the first place.
Fraser Knight there, LBC's reporter outside New Scotland Yard, just keeping us up to date with the implications of that judgment. Already, as he said, creating political reaction. We'll keep you informed about all of that. Keep our eye on it throughout the course of the day here on LBC. Want to wrap up our conversation about Elon Musk, though, now, and whether indeed he is not only the most powerful but dangerous man in the world. Simon is in Orpington. Simon, your view on this?
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. Personally, I think that Elon Musk is a puppet master. He's got the money, he's got the connections, and he's got the AI clout with X or Twitter or whatever other companies he might have, and now with this open AI thing as well. I think he could pull more and more strings to create a world in his image.
Well, I mean,
ultimate power.
Information, knowledge is power, isn't it, Simon? It's cliche, it's glib, but it's true. And I, for one, having seen and used to enjoying X Twitter, seeing what he's done to it, the information, it might seem trivial in a way, but obviously this is a primary sort of information source, particularly for news, particularly for journalism. It's been completely jaundiced and warped in his own image and his own mind. If he were to do that with AI as well, the power of that is astounding.
Well, it depends on how far down the theoretical rabbit hole you want to take it, but what limitations would there be?
I don't know.
It's a scary thought.
It is. I don't know. It's mind-blowing. As I say, I can't. I mean, you've had states in the past, and states still do control the flow of information. China still does it. Others do as well. But something like that in the hands of one person, so profound.
It's worrying times.
Simon, grateful to you. Let's talk to Bob in Salford. Bob.
Hi, Lewis.
Good morning.
It's a bit like a conspiracy show, isn't it?
Oh, I hope not. I hope not.
It is the end of democracy. America cancelling its national debt. We've had it all, haven't we, Lewis? And you've not challenged any of it.
Well,
they're doing what they said they would do.
Bob, they didn't say they wouldn't obey court orders. They didn't say that they would allow Musk to go in and shut down. They didn't say, Bob, wait a second. They didn't say that they would go in and shut down federal agencies outside of the legal powers to do so.
Who said they haven't got the legal powers?
Constitutional scholars. They don't. It's a matter of law.
No,
there is no, Bob. No. I'm not going to have you say stuff that's not true.
It's one federal judge who has decided against it.
USAID, federal agencies cannot be shut down. This is a point of information which is true. The US presidency, the executive, does not have the legal competence to shut down federal agencies which have been created by Congress. Only Congress can do that.
The courts will decide it, and then it'll go to the Supreme Court.
But why is he doing it?
Don't trust the
but why do something that we know is illegal?
They said they would cut all this waste of money.
But cutting down waste.
Lewis,
cutting down waste.
Americans actually support it, and you know that.
Cutting down waste. It doesn't matter.
That they support
it doesn't matter. People can support illegal things all the time. It doesn't make it right.
So why is it the end of democracy? Why is all this nonsense being spoken on here?
It will be
a guy who was highly elected, won the vast majority of electoral votes. Yes.
Well, he won a majority of electoral votes. It wasn't a vast majority. He won. He actually won the presidency by the third narrowest margin in terms of the popular vote since the early 20th century.
You know, the House of Commons isn't done on a popular vote, is it?
No, absolutely. I'm not saying no. I said it was an impressive victory. I'm just saying that it wasn't a gargantuan victory in the way that some of his allies pretend. And it certainly...
Is he doing what he said he would do?
Bob, it certainly wasn't a mandate, which he certainly did not stand upon, to dismantle the constitutional settlement. No president can do that. No president can do that.
So we're going to accept all this. It's the end of the world. It's the end of the financial systems.
Do you think it's possible, Bob? Would you not be concerned about Musk having too much power? You don't think it's anything to even talk about and be concerned about?
Well, I don't know if you can talk about it, but not spread wild conspiracy theories. Some of the stuff that's been on here, if Trump had said that, you'd have been calling conspiracies.
What's a conspiracy?
The end of he's going to default on the American debt.
Bob, the point is, I think what the caller was trying to say, and as a matter of fact, I did say that seemed extremely unlikely, but as a matter of fact, I think the point he was trying to get at is that what he's worried about is an unrivaled check on financial power of one man.
And they're going to cancel the midterms, aren't they?
And I said I didn't think that would happen. I said I didn't. Bob, I said I didn't think that he would cancel the elections. But what I'm saying to you is that I think it is dangerous for one man to have too much power.
I don't think he's got all that much power. There is plenty of safeguards in America.
What safeguards? It's the courts. They're saying the vice president has said that they might not accept the court's decision. That is the ultimate safeguard. Bob, I could talk to you all day, I'm sure. I'm very happy to correct the nonsense that's being peddled at any particular time, but I think we should be something that we're worried about. Good to have a contrary point of view, though, Bob. Grateful to you. We're going to move on now, though, and talk about not the present and not the future or dystopian view of the future, but the past instead, because it is 50 years to the day that one Margaret Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party in 1975 in a complete unknown virtually at that time. She had been Education Secretary and became ultimately Prime Minister, our longest serving Prime Minister for over a century. We're going to look back and ask, have we ever escaped Thatcherism? Are we still in our politics living in the Iron Lady's shadow?
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is just coming up to 12:04. You're listening to Lewis Goodall sitting in for James O'Brien here on LBC. We've looked forward to a potential future. I hope you didn't find it too depressing. For what it's worth, by the way, I actually think, on a note of optimism, just to wrap up our thoughts in the last hour, I was going to say it then, but we got rather distracted with that little tete-a-tete that we had with Bob, one way of putting it. I actually think that the biggest threat to Musk over the long term, it's been talked about, maybe he'll fall out with Trump. I still think that will happen at some point. The biggest problem he'll have is actually that it is not easy to go into different places and just smash things up. And he will come a cropper when it becomes clear that actually being a disruptor, like degrading Twitter, okay, that's fine. He went and sacked a load of people. Twitter doesn't work as well as it used to. It's not as good as it used to, but ultimately it's just Twitter. Who cares? When you're doing that with like the federal government, that becomes a problem. When you start laying off people, when your average median kind of federal government employee isn't some bureaucrat in DC, but is instead like, I don't know, a doctor responsible for sorting out healthcare, or someone working to look after soldiers or whatever it happens to be when they get back from wherever they've been deployed from abroad, when all those people start getting made unemployed, or when you go into a federal department and you disrupt things so much that people don't get their benefits on time, that's what screws things up. And that's what really ultimately will make him come a cropper, is because it's easy to go into and say you can do a Silicon Valley thing and go in and break things. But it's not that simple when you're dealing with real people's lives in government. So I think ultimately that will be the thing that does for Elon Musk. But we're moving on, as I said, because we are going to talk about the past. We're going to talk about the fact that it is 50 years to the day that Margaret Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party in February 1975. She became leader at the age of 49 after defeating former Prime Minister Ted Heath in a shock result on the first ballot of the Conservative leadership contest. Bear in mind, of course, they'd lost two elections in the previous year, the Conservative Party, in February and October 1974, albeit narrowly. It was a tiny majority for Harold Wilson in the October election of 1974. And Thatcher became basically the only person to challenge Heath, who had only won one election of the four that he had contested. She wasn't the favourite to do so. Many others who would have been more fancied, for example, her eventual deputy, Willie Whitelaw, decided to demur, decided not to take up the opportunity. There was still that case, I think, of some camaraderie between men at that time, particularly men who had served as they had done in the war, didn't want to take Heath on, but Thatcher decided to step forward herself, given that no one else was going to do it. Many people thought she would just be a stalking horse, that she would weaken Heath and someone would swoop in 6 or 12 months later and take the crown from him, but it was not to be, because she defeated him on the first ballot in a shock result, 130 votes to 119 on the 4th of February 1975, and then beat Willie Whitelaw, because she had all of the momentum, by 146 votes to 79 votes in a second ballot a week later, 50 years ago to the day. Tory MPs, of course, were the only ones who chose the leader in those days. Charles Moore, her biographer, has since revealed that when she told Dennis Thatcher, of course her husband, that she was standing, he muttered that Heath will murder you. Of course, up until that point, she had been best known for being the education secretary who'd taken free school milk away. Milk snatcher, of course. Here, listen to this. This is a boy called Roger putting a question to Margaret Thatcher when she was education secretary in 1973.
Would you like to see a woman prime minister?
I think it depends upon who the person is. I don't think that there will be a woman prime minister in my lifetime. And I don't think it depends on so much whether it's a man prime minister or a woman prime minister, as whether that person is the right person for the job at that time. And it's very difficult to foresee what may happen many, many years ahead.
Do you think it's, what you were saying earlier, just prejudice in the mind of the public, or do you think it's because women don't have the desire to become Prime Minister?
It's not wholly prejudice, let's be fair. I don't think we have enough women with the same range of experience in politics as men have had. And it is important, whoever becomes Prime Minister, that they've had quite a wide range of experience in top political jobs. And we haven't yet worked up sufficient women.
Graham Hill said last week he didn't think there'd ever be any women Grand Prix racing drivers because they weren't aggressive enough. You don't think that's the reason, do you? Lack of aggression in women?
I wouldn't say that I was guilty of lack of aggression sometimes.
Well, you can say that again. Terribly clipped there, wasn't it? Terribly, terribly clipped. Margaret Thatcher speaking in 1973 when she was Education Secretary, predicting that there would never be a woman Prime Minister in her lifetime. She, of course, went on to prove herself wrong, winning 3 general election victories in 1979, 1983 and 1987 before being eventually defenestrated by her own party in November 1990. The thing that is perhaps extraordinary. We shouldn't also gloss over the fact how extraordinary it would have seemed. I'm sure she wouldn't have been alone in 1973 and the years after in making that prediction. When she became leader of the opposition in 1975 and then Prime Minister in 1979, she was the first female political leader of a major country in the Western world. An extraordinary achievement, and how extraordinary it must have seemed at the time, particularly for people of my generation who, of course, grew up after she was in office, but certainly with the knowledge that a woman leader had taken place and it had been a very successful one. The thing that I want to talk to you about in this hour of the show is whether or not, given she was so successful, the extent to which we have ever escaped her long shadow, whether we are still living in what is fundamentally a Thatcherite age, and whether the Conservative Party in particular has ever escaped her. There is this irony, isn't there, this paradox about Thatcher, that she was their most successful leader since the war, one of their most successful leaders ever, arguably even in universal suffrage. And yet in so many ways, the sort of politics that she unleashed, her legacy, she was almost too dominant and went on to destabilise the Conservative Party by dividing very much between the sort of politics that she had, which was combative, dividing people into dries, into wets, sort of festered within the Conservative Party and fused with the question of Euroscepticism in the years after she left office. And we still have the extraordinary sight of all these years on. Think back to the 2022 leadership election for the Conservative Party, the first one, when we had Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss both vying to suggest that they were the more Thatcherite of the other, taking an extraordinary turn, really, in many ways, to a visual cue, with Liz Truss almost cosplaying as Margaret Thatcher in the type of blouse that she wore and the sort of suits that she wore during the course of that election. Have we ever escaped Margaret Thatcher's leadership, in a way? Have we ever escaped her shadow? And Is it a time for the Conservative Party to finally move on? 0345 6060 973 0345 6060 973. What are the lessons we can draw in British politics today from her extraordinary period in office? Someone who knew her well, of course, is Lord Chris Patten, former governor of Hong Kong. But before that was Environment Secretary under Margaret Thatcher. Lord Patten, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Maybe we could just go back to your earliest memories of her. Do you remember the first time you met?
Yes, I do. It was while I was a young researcher in the Conservative Research Department. She was then the opposition spokesperson on pensions, a job she'd had in government. And I remember her coming into the office to talk to our pensions expert. And he had a whooping voice, and she had a rather shrill voice until it was corrected by Gordon Rees and Laurence Olivier. So listening to them in the office talking was rather like a strange operatic duet. She was absolutely on top of all the detail, and a couple of things which aren't often said about her was that while she sounded dogmatic, in practice she wasn't as dogmatic as she usually sounded, and usually recognised that some fights weren't worth having. And I think she got very badly scarred by the milk snatcher stuff, which was imposed on her by the Treasury, and she never really wanted to do. And she couldn't understand why the Labour Party made such a fuss about it, because they'd taken milk away from secondary school pupils. Secondly, she was incredibly kind personally. I'd never saw her be rude to somebody like a driver, a waitress, a lift person, and one of our kids when we were younger, and she was 2, got badly burnt in an accident at home, and Margaret was extraordinarily generous about it. Every year at the party conference, our daughter's birthday was on October the 14th, and Margaret's had been on the 13th, and every year she'd get presented with a cake on the 13th, which she would probably give to our daughter on the 14th. She was a nice human being, and I think a lot of the things which are said about her, which suggest that she was a completely dogmatic and hard-faced, are just not true. The truth about people who say they or claim to be the next Thatcher just aren't up to it. I mean, even if their view of Thatcher was a correct one, the most important thing that she did, and the reason why, to go back to your interesting remarks about the length of her shadow, the most important thing that she did was to save Britain from relative economic decline, becoming absolute economic decline. Jim Callaghan, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer and then Prime Minister before her until 1979, when he bogged up calling the election, which he benefited from. Jim Callaghan said in the 1970s that if he was a young person, he'd emigrate. And he also said that he thought that parliamentary democracy was under threat because of our economic weakness. And what she did, I think, was to sometimes making mistakes, but by and large, what happened was really significant and important, was to prevent relative decline turning into absolute decline, and she made Britain governable again. And when you think about it, one of her main achievements was, I suppose, Tony Blair. Yes. And the way the Labour Party moved back into the world of the sane. I think she's a very considerable figure.
Sorry, Lord Patten, you weren't in politics then, or you weren't in Parliament then, but I was saying before how extraordinary it must have seemed when she became Conservative leader. Do you remember her becoming Conservative leader 50 years ago?
Yes, I do.
And what you thought of it?
Yeah, I'll tell you exactly. I'll tell you a story. When I was that stage the director of the Conservative Party's research department, which I'd been given the job by Ted Heath, Rab Butler, who'd been in many respects the sort of father of the Conservative Research Department, the main shaper of Conservative policy in the years after the war, the 44 Education Act and so on. He was outrageously ambiguous and always ambivalent, if you get the difference. And he came to visit the research department, which had been his creation one day, and at the beginning of that election campaign, and we were going up in the lift, the cranky old lift in the building we worked in, and he said to me, he was there in his black coat with turned up and his hat. He said to me, I don't suppose we need to take this Thatcher business seriously, do we? I remember saying, you'd have to take it very seriously, not least because the parliamentary party had got really fed up with Ted, and she was the only obvious alternative, obvious increasingly because of her success in one or two parliamentary debates. She was, I think, for a time put in charge of some of the economics in the opposition, and she made a terrific job of knocking spots off the Labour Party. So, I remember her at that side, and I also remember the extent to which she was patronised by the men around her, including some who obviously thought not only that they were a lot cleverer than she was, but a lot more capable of handling the difficult issues which were beyond that of a Finchley housewife.
What do you think has been her long-term legacy for the Conservative Party, though? I mean, you're glowing about her domestic legacy for the country, which some people would agree with and disagree with. We can talk about that later in the show. But in terms of her legacy to the Conservative Party, as I was saying, it is extraordinary, isn't it, in some ways? So dominant has she been, long after her death now, never mind her actually being Prime Minister, that you still have Conservative leadership hopefuls trying to establish themselves in relation to her. I mean, it would be like Labour leadership hopefuls, still talking about whether they're comparing themselves to Wilson or to Callaghan. Well, never happened.
Or Clem Attlee.
Well, quite.
No, I agree with you. And there's a worse aspect to it. Most of them are comparing themselves to a Thatcher who never existed, or who only existed in occasional headlines in the Daily Mail or Daily Telegraph, because she was far more pragmatic than people today suggest. The irony is she sounded more dogmatic when she was out of office than she'd ever been in office. And I think people seize on that. And I think the other aspect of her legacy is that people regarded her fall as being a consequence of disagreement with her over Europe, and they regarded her, I think, as the sort of princess in the tower who was destroyed by wicked barons. I don't think it was like that at all. I think far more important than Europe in her downfall was the poll tax, which I should know about.
You were in charge of it.
I was in charge. I didn't invent the bloody thing.
I think that's what they call a hospital pass.
It was a hospital pass with the whole of the opposition pack bearing down on you, and it all went back to her campaigning in 1979. No, earlier,
against the rates.
When she was pressurised by colleagues into promising both a fixed rate for mortgages in order to win over homeowners, and a complete reform of the domestic rating system. And then some very clever people came up with the poll tax, which was, of course, the most unpopular single policy any group of politicians have ever come up with.
I can't. It's obviously an anachronism in one sense, Lord Patten, but I can't resist asking you, what do you think she would make of Donald Trump?
I don't think she would have either been so unwise as to calling rude letters before he won rude things before she won an election, nor would she be polishing his shoes now. I think she would have had difficulty being too enthusiastic about somebody who, when he'd plainly lost an election, unleashed a mob to attack Parliament, and then when they beat up policemen, and he became president or boss in due course, to let them out of jail and to forgive them. I think she would have found that very different from her own values. And I think today we have a problem that while we need to do what we can to secure the national interest while he's rampaging about, it's very difficult to talk about the special relationship with somebody whose values very few of us agree with.
And just finally, Lord Patten, but do you think that Kemi Badenoch, obviously one of her successors as Conservative leader, and other leading Conservatives, what lessons do you think they should draw from Thatcher's period in office and indeed in opposition?
I think they should learn the importance of having a set of ideas which are genuinely relevant to the condition of the country and to the problems we face, and not being shy about making them clear what your views are. It was with Margaret. It wasn't just in relation to economics. It was also in relation to foreign policy, and one shouldn't forget about the Iron Lady being attacked for being hostile to the Soviet Union at a time when the Soviet Union was being even more hostile to us than Russia is being today. So I think to have a clear intellectual framework for what you're saying, but wanting to do, but for making sure it's relevant to the country's problems. The problem about the Conservative Party, I think, today, and who am I to say, is that it's rather difficult to define what it is. And I think that a piece of advice that Kemi Badenoch would be well advised to take is to take no notice of people who say she's got to play footsie with Nigel Farage, who's made single-handedly the country much worse off than it otherwise would have been because of Brexit.
Lord Chris Patten there, of course, was in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet and knew her well. I want to talk to you about whether we have ever escaped Margaret Thatcher's shadow, whether the Conservative Party has as well. We heard a glowing assessment there of what Thatcher left, especially domestically. Perhaps you have different views about the country that Margaret Thatcher bequeathed. 0345 6060 973, 0345 6060 973. I'll give you my own assessment throughout the course of the hour as well, and we'll be covering a couple of other stories. Into the bargain. You're listening to Lewis Goodall here on LBC. The time is 12:23.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:25. Few of your texts on Thatcher. Ben says, Thatcher sounds so different in the clip you played. You can tell she had vocal coaching to give her that deeper voice when she was PM. Yes, she absolutely did. And she became a caricature of herself over time as well. It sort of happened more and more. Nikki says, Lewis, I think Thatcher will be horrified at what the Tory party has morphed into. In her last speech to the House of Commons, she declared how proud she was of the single market she created in the EU. She'd been appalled by Brexit. Thatcher also warned of climate change. It's true, she did in the UN in 1989, and would have been dismayed that Brexit and climate change became culture wars and ideology. And Julie says, Lewis, Thatcher is responsible for many industrial wastelands all over this island. She took the milk from school children and the jobs of millions. She's hated by the vast majority of Scots old enough to remember her tenure. Thatcher should be remembered by the carnage she inflicted on the working people, nothing else. Let's talk to Greg, who is in Liverpool, who I think has something to say about the deindustrialisation that we saw under Thatcher. Greg.
Yeah, hi Lewis. Yeah, I am from one of those industrial wastelands in the Black Country, and it's from a small town called Bilston.
Yeah, I know.
And I think you might know it well. So I wrote a PhD called In the Shadow of Elizabeth, which was a Labour history of the campaign to try and save the steelworks, which ultimately there was a form of managed decline that was undertook under Wilson and Callaghan, but ultimately it was Thatcher who closed it formally in 1981, and I just want to talk about the catastrophic impact it had on the community and other working class communities across the country under her leadership. I mean, we can talk about, for me, I interviewed many steelworkers, their families, including members of my own family who worked there. I had 3 generations of my own family worked in the steelworks, and just this loss of identity and the sense of place that these towns had under Thatcher, under her deindustrialisation processes, the pride and that inherent feeling that people had working in coal, steel, and shipyards, that it was meant to be their natural bed.
But what would you say, Greg, and we can sort of debate the extent to which the sort of harshness of the medicine, but what would you say to the argument, because it wasn't just, deindustrialisation obviously wasn't just a British phenomenon. A lot of these whole heavy industries, similar events took place in continental Europe, in other industrial powers, the United States as well. There is an argument to say that this was coming one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, under Wilson, under his white heat speech, we all knew that there was going to be a process of decline, and with that, obviously, there's going to be a process of offshoring jobs. But it was the manner in which it was delivered, and that's the point. It was the blunt tool in which it was delivered. And I hear these stories about Thatcher was a lovely person in person, individually. I mean, that's great. But tell that to the many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people whose life's chances were undermined by the processes in which she enacted. Now, of course, under Wilson, for example, there were deliberate mechanisms that would see to actually replace these jobs. There were higher redundancies as well, which would give people a certain amount of time to actually prepare themselves and go back into the workforce. But Thatcher ignored all that. It was a blunt hammer, and it was deliberate, and she did it with just a lack of compassion as well. So I accept the fact these processes were put in place by others, but they were celebrated by her, and they were done with a callousness that had never been seen before under the post-war consensus.
Greg, grateful to you. Let's talk to Alan, who is in Amesbury. Alan.
Hi. Yeah, thanks, Lewis. I was listening to a clip of Ronald Reagan the other day, and he was of course, very close to Thatcher, and he was talking about free markets, how free markets was the great kind of success story of the post-war period, and how America was kind of like a big beneficiary of that.
Yes.
And he was saying, beware of those threatening our allies with tariffs and all this kind of stuff, and setting up trade wars. And it made me think about Thatcher and Reagan. They were both big advocates of small state, free markets.
Yes.
And that very much was kind of like the image of the Conservative Party at that time. The free markets do not interfere with the free markets. You barely hear that anymore.
Yes.
The Conservative Party has gone further and further to the right. You barely hear about free markets. In fact, they're closing down free markets by leaving the European Union. By the way, it was Maggie Thatcher that signed the Single European Act.
Yes, her greatest achievement, wasn't it?
That free market
Yep.
across Europe, because that's what she believed in. And people talk about it's now the nationalist part of the Conservative Party which has taken over.
Yes.
Absolutely, and the Thatcherite free market argument has been left long behind.
Well, I think, Alan, that Lord Patten was correct in a sense that Thatcher has become such a sort of domineering and dominant figure over the Conservative Party and its kind of intellectual legacy that she is deeply misunderstood. And one of the things, I mean, I think you see that manifestation in all sorts of ways. We saw it with Liz Truss, for example. Liz Truss, who obviously lionised and idolised Thatcher to the point of even sort of dressing like her, actually completely has a sort of deeply superficial view of what Thatcher was like as a political player. You know, we've got this idea that now she was just so dominant and so strong that she would do everything at once, which is completely opposite of the case. She was actually far more strategic. For example, she didn't take on the miners until about 5 or 6 years into her premiership. And Truss just kind of completely misunderstood all of that because she had no appreciation of history.
Yeah, totally agree.
Alan, well, we'll leave it there then, Alan. I love to have a little bit of consensus on this show as well, although Thatcher wouldn't have liked that. She didn't like consensus whatsoever. We're going to continue this conversation. 50 years since Margaret Thatcher became leader of the Conservatives. What is her legacy in Britain today? 0345 6060 973. One thing I think you can say that Thatcher had, which many of her successors as Prime Minister and political leaders do not have, and I would probably include what we have at the moment, is that whether you agreed with her or disagreed with her, she was a clear political teacher. She had a clear ideological core which gave formation, coherence, a sort of adhesive to her governments and to her politics. It gave a very clear sense to her government where it was going, whether you liked it or not. Everyone knew why she was in politics. Is that true? I would say that one of Starmer's problems right now is that he is unable, or at least does not frequently, answer that question. At the very least, it is not obvious. We'll continue this conversation right after, given it's 12:31 now, right after the LBC News headlines with Amelia Cox.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 12:35. We'll continue our discussion about Margaret Thatcher's legacy, long legacy, in a moment. But first, a different story, one that maybe you haven't heard of, but one I think should be getting a lot more attention than it is, because lots of people are talking about a scandal as the new thalidomide. But again, it concerns something you may not have heard, which is sodium valproate. This is a drug that was once prescribed to women who were pregnant to help with epilepsy, but it has left children, now adults, many of them, with severe disabilities. As many as 20,000 babies in the UK may have been harmed by it since the 1970s. Details of the risk it posed to babies were intentionally withheld at the time by UK regulators. Women were told it was completely safe, and yet 4 in 10, 40%, exposed to the drug, the babies exposed to the drug, were left disabled. Some with severe physical deformities in their arms, their legs, and internal organs. Today, many require full-time care. Now, there has been a landmark report recently setting out how a compensation scheme might work for this. It was something that the the now government, when it was in opposition, hailed and talked about and said that they would like to do, but there has been very, very little done. In fact, nothing done so far. Well, we're joined now by Emma Murphy and Janet Williams. Both are from the sodium valproate campaign. In fact, both Janet and Emma have children affected and diagnosed with fetal valproate syndrome. Emma, Janet, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Emma, maybe we can start with you. Just for people who aren't familiar with this, just tell us about your story.
Okay, so I was diagnosed with epilepsy when I was age 13. I was quickly put onto sodium valproate. I was pretty much left on it, to be honest. When it came to having children, I was given no warnings about the risk. Me and my husband at every appointment when pregnant asked would the pregnancy be okay, would the children be harmed, and we were just told that it is the safest medicine to control seizures and to continue taking it, and that is obviously what I and thousands of women in the UK have done. That was the advice from practitioners, and we listened.
And what happened?
Well, I've got 5 children now. They have all been affected by sodium valproate in pregnancy. They all have lifelong disabilities, diagnosis of autism, cerebral palsy, deafness, incontinence, epilepsy. And it is just absolutely devastating, not just for them, but for us all as a family.
And Janet, just tell us about, there was obviously, as I was alluding to, there were recommendations made by Dr. Henrietta Hughes, England's Patient Safety Commissioner, saying victims deserve financial redress because you'd been failed by the regulators in the state, Janet. But what has happened since?
Morning, Lewis. Not a lot has happened since, to be quite truthful with you. I mean, that was 12 months ago. We've met with Dr. Henrietta Hughes since to discuss the way forward. We've had a meeting with the Health Minister back in December where not very much was discussed about the topic. She wanted to know more about how families were suffering and dealing with the issues. And nothing really has come of it since. We keep going down to Parliament and lobbying MPs, but unfortunately there's just nothing coming out of the government at all.
And Janet, could you tell us your story? What happened to you?
Yeah, well, I started on valproate when I was about 16. And I had my first child when I was 24. We weren't given any information about how valproate was going to harm the children. And when he was born, he had withdrawal. So he was jittery and shaky, refusing his feed, very sleepy and floppy. And they took him down to the ICU where they weaned him using a different drug. They just told us that it was withdrawal at the time, which was understandable. They didn't tell us that they brought a geneticist in who had actually diagnosed him at the time with fetal valproate syndrome. About 12 months on, I had my second child. And the same happened again, exactly the same situation. It wasn't until 12 months after that we went to see a geneticist, and she actually said to us that she'd written to the doctors and she could see no other reason other than the valproate why the boys had the problems that they had.
And you were told at the time, Janet, that all of this, nothing to worry about, it was completely safe.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, just like thousands of others were.
And how, Emma, you were told, I think Wes Streeting, when he was the Shadow Health Secretary, had said that, given you some support for the campaign, but you've heard, in terms of government action, you've got no idea about any sort of timetable now.
No, we don't. And that's what's so disheartening, is that we had so much support beforehand, and there's just zero silence now at the moment. And there's thousands of children out there who need help and support now. You know, they keep saying to us that, you know, we're going to hear from them imminently and they're working at pace. Well, we've been hearing that for the last 9 years, and they need to get on with it now, just like Dr. Henrietta Hughes said.
How?
These are children that need help and support now.
It must feel like you're banging your heads against a brick wall.
Absolutely, it does.
What do you want to happen? Well, if you could speak to the Health Secretary right now and send him a message, what would you say to him, Emma?
Oh, go on, sorry.
To act now. These are children and adults with lifelong disabilities, and they need help and support now. We have been campaigning at Westminster for 14 years. They have had the archive documents for 9 years now. Get on with it. You are working at a snail's pace.
Janet, do you think in the end you will get justice?
I'm hoping we will. I'm just hoping it doesn't take them too long now to do this. I mean, we've had the backing of the Sunday Times on this topic as well. So, the more pressure we can put on them now, the better. And they need to take action now.
Emma Murphy there and Janet Williams, both from the Sodium Valproate campaign group. In fact, it is an absolute scandal which is not getting enough attention. Hope managed to add a little bit of pressure here on LBC. It's clearly a massive example, yet another example of state failure, state injustice, which is not being addressed. We're talking about Margaret Thatcher and her legacy. Let's talk to George in Mansfield, which of course is a part of the country, Nottinghamshire, which was very much at the centre in many ways of the Thatcher premiership. George, your thoughts on this?
Well, my thoughts on it, Lewis. Good afternoon. I was a former NUM branch secretary within the coalfields of this area.
Right. And, during the miners' strike?
Of course,
yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Year on strike. Yeah, when I blame no. I mean, to retrack a little bit. I mean, through your previous commenters, Lord this, Lord that, and Lord other. I mean, while they can talk about the essence of the economics of the situation and so forth and praise it, we had to deal with it. We had to deal with the everyday occurrences like police on the streets, closing down of our colliery, which was a profitable colliery at the time. And those police on the street breaking into my house, smashing my house up. That was the true sense of this. And one spread generation of people that toiled in godforsaken circumstances and so forth, being treated basically like they were. There's just no logic or economic sense to that.
So when you think of her, George, and you hear someone like Lord Patten saying she was a nice person, what's your reaction to that?
Well, she wasn't. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, she probably was to him because she taught their sort of language. But the language of communities like ours, which have pitched in with helping one another, the sense that she said there's no such thing as society. Well, we practiced that. We practiced society and communities before she came along.
What do you think her legacy is?
Well, around the hatred.
Even to this day, all these years on?
Even to this day, I deal with welfare rights in our area. A lot of miners, a lot of people, and the level of poverty in this area. You can take it really the legacy of that back right to that.
But isn't it interesting, George? Because sometimes there's sort of distance. I mean, I don't know where you are on politics right now, but it's interesting that in a lot of those areas, places like Mansfield, but lots of sort of working class areas and old mining towns, which would never have voted Tory. Maybe there was an Brexit element in 2019. Many of them, who are they most keen on right now? Nigel Farage, who is one of the biggest Thatcherites going, huge admirer of Margaret Thatcher.
Exactly. Right, we've got a reform candidate here, Lee Anderson. MP that represents. So, in a sense, the Labour Party, has let the people down, has let the miners, former miners, except in the fact that we've got justice for once in his lifetime because the surpluses of mine workers' pension scheme have been returned back to the miners' widows, and so forth, which was an injustice in itself, which the Tories let go. So, yeah, so there's been returned, but I do agree with that. I do agree with what you're saying, right? Because there's a sense of hopelessness in these areas. There's nobody to turn to, so they turn to the radical sense of politics.
When you just finally, George, when you think back to those days, the miners' strike, what memories come back? How do you reflect on it now?
How do I reflect on it now? Well, I was a very young man in them days, and I was branch secretary. I was in charge of 1,500 men who were on strike. I had to feed them and all that sort of thing. So it boiled up to responsibility. I thought the struggle was right because basically no one would listen to through the many conciliation schemes we've got. So we took them on head on. We lost. That's fair enough. But we didn't lose. I mean, the whole trade union movement lost.
And never recovered.
And never recovered. No, but you see the legacy of us losing today: low wages, insecurity of employment, low employment rate, and that was a direct result from us losing that battle. There were no other choice for us.
George there in Mansfield, talking from, well, literally the coalface, or at least what was once the coalface, centre, one of the absolute centres of the political battles of the 1980s in Nottinghamshire. Big mining area once upon a time. You're listening to Lewis Goodall here on LBC. We'll continue this conversation right up until 1 o'clock. The time right now has just turned 12:47.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 12:49. A few of your texts here. Julie Lewis says Thatcher is responsible for many industrial wastelands all over this country. She took the milk from school children. Got another text here saying, Michael Lewis, for goodness sake, don't let this become a rehabilitation hour for Thatcher. The damage she wrought on the economy in the country is still with us. Name one privatised industry that has succeeded by thinking people loved by the I'm all right Jack devil takes the I'm all right Jack view still dominates. I hated her and I still do. It's extraordinary, the ferocity that people still have. I think when I was talking to Lord Patten earlier, talking about the lessons that the Conservative Party, the contemporary Conservative Party takes from her, the wrong lessons, I think it's because they remember actually the Thatcher as she became rather than as she was, certainly when she started in office. And she had become an almost cartoonish figure of herself, a caricature of herself, sort of given into her weakest instinct. Just listen to this. This is a clip that I always think demonstrates this. This is her talking in a documentary after she left office, talking about a moment, and you'll hear the sort of the documentary announcer, the presenter, talking at the very first bit, talking about when she allowed Ronald Reagan, then President Reagan, to use British air bases or American bases based in Britain to attack Libya.
In the spring of 1986, Margaret Thatcher received an urgent and secret request from the American president. Ronald Reagan asked her to let him use British air bases for an attack on the Libyan president, Colonel Gaddafi. The Prime Minister agreed. France and other European allies had refused.
It had the effect of cementing the Anglo-American alliance. There's another point. What's the good of having bases if when you want to use them you're not allowed to by the home country? It made America realize that Britain was her real and true friend when they were hard up against it and wanted something, and that no one else in Europe was. They're a weak lot, some of them in Europe, you know. Weak. Feeble.
Yep, there we have the former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. They're a weak lot, some of them in Europe, you know. Weak, feeble. And that is what I mean. You know, she became a caricature of herself in the end. And particularly, look, just very briefly in terms of my own assessment, look, Margaret Thatcher was clearly a titanic figure in British politics. She was highly, highly successful. She won 3 general elections, the first on the trot since Lord Liverpool to do so, first Conservative leader to do so. And we are still, I think, living in her shadow in all sorts of ways. But her legacy, I think, is complicated. It is more nuanced than either her worst detractors or her most fervent supporters would allow. Just running through it. Lots of decisions she made continue to affect us to this day. North Sea oil, a great boon, a great almost sort of gift from God for the British economy in the late 70s and 1980s. To be fair, started in process by the Labour governments of the 70s. She didn't create a sovereign wealth fund, as the Norwegians did, which currently means they have no national debt. Instead, she used it to plug tax receipts. That's continued ever since. The privatisation, mixed. Some of it was clearly successful. It was crazy. For example, I think in many ways that the telecoms industry was still controlled by the state or airlines and so on, British Airways. But then, obviously, clearly, it was an ideological project that went too far. Look at the water industry today, laden with debt in a way that it didn't have then. Devolution settlement, she frayed the bonds between different nations of the United Kingdom, particularly Scotland. There's also the legacy, the troubled legacy in Northern Ireland, where violence became commonplace, where she's still roundly disliked. But then on the other hand, she signed the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, which to some extent set the process in motion for the peace process that we have today. Deindustrialisation, still with us. Right to buy, the legacy of right to buy, still with us. A decision she made not to allow councils to rebuild and use the proceeds of council tax receipts to build houses, still leaves an enormous social housing legacy to this day. The single market, perhaps her greatest achievement, we ourselves have withdrawn from, partly because of the way she conducted herself when she left office. So, in the sense that she decided to legitimise a profound Euroscepticism, within the Conservative Party. And yet she did transform the economy in so many ways and bequeathed a view of political economy that lasted, at least I would say, till the financial crisis, and certainly even till 2016 and 2017, and still has elements still intact today. So she was completely dominant in all sorts of ways. It is inescapable and continues to be so. Matt is in Lincoln. Matt.
Oh, thanks for taking the call.
Not at all.
I've just listened to everything you've said, and the nuance, I don't see any nuance. The woman was an absolute long-term disaster for this country. You've just said yourself, social housing, 1.2 million houses had gone before she left office. They're desperate to build 1.5. That's her legacy. That's just some of her legacy. The misery that's still causing. There isn't another country in the world whose utilities are run by other countries. The gas, the water, the electric, these are all our biggest problems. This legacy isn't nuanced. It isn't nuanced. It's a legacy brought on by an obsession with a free market economy.
But it is true, Matt, isn't it? But you know, let's consider the country in 1979. I mean, Britain was a basket case in 1979. I mean, the industrial relations were entirely out of kilter. Trade unions were too powerful. There was a situation. Multiple governments had been brought down by too much trade union power. She did, for good or ill, and she did it via pretty blunt force trauma, I would say. But she did solve that problem.
She did. She solved that problem, but she caused myriad other problems, and they still resonate today. She could have done what she had to do. She had to do it, or somebody had to do it. Preferably, it wouldn't have been her. She could have done what she did without the damage, the decimation of those. Oh, and one other thing, that George from Mansfield was correct in what he said about the unions losing the battle, as it were. It didn't go far enough, though. He said the unions lost out. The whole country lost out. We're still losing out now. I'm still listening, and people say we need Thatcher. But even Ken Clarke said recently, they more or less said, thankfully, she'd gone. But she wanted to privatise the NHS. That was in the pipeline.
Well, she never did it, of course, because she knew it would never have worked. Matt, I want to get someone else in. One other thing, I'm getting someone here say, Lewis, how could you talk about Thatcher without addressing Northern Ireland? Just talked about her legacy with the Anglo-Irish Agreement and other things as well. Darren is in Rochester. I think might have the last word on this. Darren, I think you have a more positive thing to say about Margaret Thatcher.
Absolutely, Lewis. I totally agree with what you said in the late 70s. You know, I was a child of that. I was a working class grammar school kid, as lots of my friends and my wife, and she opened the city up. Oiks like me could suddenly go in from Essex and Kent and go and work in the city of London. Previously, you had to go to the right public school. Absolutely revolutionised and changed the city, and we are still reaping the benefit today. The biggest tax revenue generator for this country.
Didn't go so well with the financial crash, though, did it, Darren? All the deregulation.
That was called worldwide, Lewis. That was nothing to do with Thatcher. But the city itself is the biggest money tax generator in this country by miles. The other thing, BBC computers. She put a BBC computer, I think Geoffrey Howe, into every single primary school in Britain. We now have the legacy of probably some of the best programmers in the world because of her actions there.
All right,
so,
Darren,
yes,
grateful to you.
Polarised,
Darren,
but there are some
grateful to you. Peter, you got 30 seconds. What can you say about Margaret Thatcher in 30 seconds, Peter?
Well, I was at school in 1968, and it was Edward Short, the Secretary of State for Education under the Labour government, who took the milk away from me.
Oh, right, okay. We don't talk about Ted Short's legacy. That's what we should do. That's an hour for tomorrow.
He took away the milk from all the over-11s.
Yeah. Okay, Peter, I didn't expect Ted Short to emerge as a villain in today's hour of the show, but hey, maybe we could do more on it tomorrow. I am out of time, though. Maybe Sheila will take it up in the next hour if you missed any of today's show.
Can I just say, I'm old enough to remember...
Ted Short?
The milk that I got in primary school, in these little sort of... It felt very futuristic at the time, although they were about 20 little triangular sort of 3D Palace of Versailles type cubey things with
Palace of Versailles. What kind of school were you in?
It was very grand.
You're Madame de Pompadour over here.
Cecilia's in Tubrook in Liverpool. No, but it was great. There was that, and there was what was the other thing they got rid of as well? They brought that back in now, Labour, haven't they? Teaching kids to brush their teeth and giving them toothpaste and a toothbrush. I had that too. I am 103.
Maybe they could bring us milk here in LBC. That would be nice, wouldn't it, of an afternoon?
We'd be fitter for it.
We're Exactly. Well, of course, you can listen back to this show on Global Player, and you can get the best bits via James O'Brien Daily, the new podcast, which I've been hosting while James is away. Download now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick. But for now, it is the woman who still got her milk back in the day, Sheila Fogarty.
I did. Do the words Eisel toilet paper mean anything to you?
No, and I'm off right now.
James O'Brien on LBC.